think you should go. Let me call the Committee on Natural Resources to order. The committee today is meeting to hear testimony on the impacts of climate change and the need for Congress and the administration to act. Under the Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Welcome, everyone, to the first hearing of the 116th Congress on the Natural Resources Committee. And thank you to our witnesses for appearing before us as we begin to tackle one of the most urgent and pressing challenges of our time. The majority of Americans consider meaningful action on climate change to be a moral and economic imperative. They're absolutely right. And they have friends on this committee, including myself and other colleagues who are here to work on solutions. Climate change is real. The emissions we produce from burning fossil fuels are making it worse. It is a threat to our public health, national security, infrastructure, and natural resources. We are seeing the impacts now, and they will grow stronger unless we change course. Our communities are paying the price for years of inaction on this issue. The massive and unprecedented storms, heat waves, fires, and droughts we are experiencing are not normal. They are being made worse by climate change, and if we don't take action now, we're only at the beginning of this process. The last 4 years have been the 4 hottest years ever recorded. Ice sheets are melting far faster than previously thought. The coast of Alaska is literally disappearing into the ocean. Indigenous villages are already having to relocate. We will see more climate refugees as time goes on. Parts of our planet where people currently live may very well become uninhabitable. Every day that we fail to act increases the cost of addressing this crisis for future generations. Putting our heads in the sand puts people's lives at risk and our nation's safety in jeopardy. Today, we turn the page on this committee from climate change denial to climate action. The Democratic majority is here to listen to people, to work for people, to hear from Americans across the country from all walks of life whose experiences emphasize the need to address this crisis. The rest of the world understands the urgent need to take action on climate change. The Trump administration chooses to mock science, mislead the public about what our country will look like if we do nothing. As President Trump expands fossil fuel production on public lands, roll back protections for clean air and clean water, suppress the role of science, and turn his back on international agreements, we have situations. That's why states, local community leaders, businesses, and many others are stepping up. They can't wait for action from an administration that appears not to care about their own well-being and of their constituents. This is a great opportunity for American entrepreneurs to lead the way in creating and deploying new energy technologies the world will need. But with people's lives in imminent danger, we know that we need more than innovation. We need good policies. Climate change is a matter of social justice. Communities of color and tribes are disproportionately impacted by climate change and will continue to struggle unless we take action. Along with testimony from our witnesses today, I invite the public to provide their climate crisis stories at naturalresources.house.gov. I'd like to briefly share just one of the many stories we've already heard from the public. This is from a woman named Katie Davis, who wrote from Goleta, California. Last July, quote, last July on a freakishly hot night that broke records across Southern California, a fire suddenly broke out in our neighborhood due to hot winds, the likes of which I have never felt before, that pushed flames toward us rapidly. It was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. We ran out of the house with nothing, no time to prepare, and fled. Our house survived with minor damage, but on that anguishing night, most of the houses on our street burned down. I look at the foundations of 5 burned-out houses as I write this. These are the stories we need to hear in this committee and in this Congress. The best policies are informed by a combination of sound science and informed public input. These are the guideposts for this committee, both in our hearing today and everything we do in the next 2 years. Climate change is an urgent problem. It demands urgent action and a sense of purpose from Congress. This committee will offer both. I want to thank you again to the witnesses. I look forward to your testimony, and I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Bishop, for his opening statement.
Congratulations, Mr. Grijalva, on your first full committee chairing. I know you had a ranking member chairmanship at the time, but that was a long, long time ago. So I'm happy to have you here. Happy to be here for this particular discussion. I know you have made February as Climate Change Month. I appreciate the fact that you picked the shortest month of the year to do that. Also, it happens to be, of course, Black History Month, which I wish we could deal with some other things, because in the last couple of years, this committee has done some significant issues in the area of federal lands and projects. I mean, we have expanded the Martin Luther King Home historic site, as well as Little Rock High School in Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, which I had the opportunity of going to this summer and was amazed at how actually great that was as a narrative history of what's going on here. We will have in the lands package the Senate's pushing over the establishment of the Medgar Evers National Monument, Camp Nelson National Monument. We also did the Kennedy King Historic Area in Indiana this particular year, as well as the African American Civil Rights Network, and reauthorizing historically black colleges and university preservation grant programs. All of those are within the purview of this committee. That's our jurisdiction. Talking about those kinds of things would be very positive. In the ones I have just listed to you also, there is a $41 million maintenance backlog just on the programs I just enunciated. Talking about that is in the jurisdiction of this committee. The chairman has been very good in helping us come up with ways of funding that maintenance backlog creatively in the past. I hope we can actually get to those kinds of activities, which would be extremely important. All right, now focusing to the topic of this particular meeting, it is my hope that what we do is coming up with ways we can actually help people. Utah, for example, has had terrible air. It's part of the topography, especially in the wintertime. But it is much better than Representative Curtis and I, the air that Representative Curtis and I grew up in Utah, simply because of the actions of the state of Utah. EPA and other federal agencies over the last 15 years haven't done squat, but the state has made major changes. And I hope that we can look at how we can do those types of changes. I appreciate the fact we have 2 governors here with us today. Thank you for being here. Once again, it would have been nice to have known some of the topics of this hearing, even though Rule 4C requires that to be in there and transparency requires it. We did not have time to invite another governor. I would have loved to have a governor from the West come here and join you two, simply because they unfortunately are in the middle of their legislative sessions, the beginning of their legislative sessions, and could not make it at short notice. But they actually have federal lands that we have, over which we have jurisdiction that would be an input. But I hope that you guys can enlighten us, even though you're only governors. You're one of those peons that work in the outer hinterlands of America that really aren't as important as we here in the federal government. So we appreciate your groveling before us, because all of us and the agencies breathe the rarefied air and drink the leaded water of Washington. Therefore, we know exactly what is right to do. And for you to actually come here on hands and knees, I appreciate that. I hope, though, in the process, you can give us some ideas of what y'all are trying to do in your states, how maybe permitting process, we can work with you easier to actually allow states to become partners with us instead of being dominated by us, to find real solutions for real people. That, I hope, is the ultimate goal of what we are attempting to do. As I said, Utah has amazingly bad air in the winter. It's part of the topography. When it's snowing on the ground, the mountains prohibit any kind of wind gusts from cleaning out the atmosphere. We never have bad weather in the summer, except for this year, which meant that as every forest burned in California, a week later, we were breathing the air of the burned California. And that was the unique. And that's going to happen again unless we actually can do something about that, which is why the frustration I had with the Senate using the filibuster to gut most of the forest fire reforms that we passed. That's one of the things that is in the jurisdiction of this committee, and I wish we were talking about that. If we actually were able to control forest fires by different managing systems, that our expert like Mr. Westerman, who has a doctorate in this area, that the experts from the Forest Service in both the Obama and Trump administration told us they needed to do to manage the lands, we could actually help with the environment. There is another one too, even though a lot of the people who are well, carbon sequestration. If we actually want to get carbon out of the air, there is enough of new studies that are being done, specifically in Portugal and Australia, and here in the United States as well, that talk about the way of using carbon sequestration to use plant life, which needs carbon, to suck it out of the air and put it into the ground where it can be useful for plant life, and then also help clean the air. That is the jurisdiction of this committee. And those are the kinds of things I hope we can do to talk about specific issues. So I have to mention, I'm kind of a loss. I do not know where this hearing is going, or the other 6 hearings you've planned, because you simply haven't told us where the goal is. At some point, we may be asking, where are we going? What is the real legislation to help people that's supposed to come out of these hearings? To understand whether these hearings are simply for those of us around the horseshoe who are going to make legislation, or are these hearings designed for that group that's sitting at a table in the corner so they can write cute stories? Once again, we have not been given the details of where these hearings are going. We would like to know that in the future. And with that, we're ready to get started on this wonderful new adventure in a month that only has 28 days. But I would like Rule 4C to be instituted so that we actually can have greater understanding and preparation so we can participate fully with you in these hearings. And governors, thank you for joining us. Thank you for groveling before us. I'm looking forward to your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop, and I can assure you that in terms of all the areas of jurisdiction and on this particular topic that I think has significance and consequences over all our jurisdictions that this committee is under, that we'll aptly be able to, and adroitly as well, chew gum and walk. We can do all these things. And let me first
Are you saying that because I'm chewing gum?
Yes.
Okay, fine.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce our first panel, our distinguished panel, which consists of the Governor of North Carolina, the Honorable Roy Cooper, and the Governor of Massachusetts, the Honorable Charles Baker. I appreciate them being here, taking the time, in particular, bringing an insight. I don't know if it's so much a question of groveling, but setting an example where across party lines, people confront the issue of climate change, the effect on their constituents, and begin to take action. I think that is an important example that we need to remind ourselves that we are not impotent to do nothing. We're not impotent to do anything about this. We can and we should. And the point is that we have elected executives here, governors, who can speak to those issues today, and I welcome them. I want to particularly thank Governor Baker for scheduling the Patriots Victory Parade yesterday so that he could be here and it wouldn't conflict with this hearing. Very, very much appreciated. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statements, governors, will appear in the hearing record. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left in the presentation, and red when time is up. After the governors have testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask them questions. I would like to inform the members of the committee that due to commitments, the governors can only be here. We have a hard stop of 11:30. So depending on how many members are here, we may need to shorten the time each member has to ask questions. With that, the chair now recognizes Governor Cooper of North Carolina for his testimony. Welcome, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, for your hospitality. Thank you, Ranking Member Bishop, for your expression of humility through humor. Thanks to all of the other other members of the committee. We're grateful to be here today. As a lifelong resident and now its governor, I know that North Carolina is a fantastic place to live, grow a family, and have a business. Between our majestic mountains, miles of coastline, and scenic tourist venues, a visit to North Carolina is bound to be the time of your life. But just like many places in our country and across the globe, we're beginning to feel the harsh effects of climate change on our communities and our economy. Scientists have found that climate change makes weather more erratic, it makes storms larger and more powerful, and it intensifies heavy rainfalls and drought. North Carolinians, unfortunately, know about this the hard way. We have weathered 2 so-called 500-year floods within 2 years, and 3 of them within 20 years. In the western North Carolina mountains, erratic weather has caused mudslides, damaged infrastructure, cost apple growers valuable crops, and forced ski areas to close mid-season, hurting local businesses and putting jobs in jeopardy. In central North Carolina, soaring summer temperatures have killed poultry and crops, costing farmers critical income. Fort Bragg and Military Ocean Terminal Sunny Point, 2 of the most important military installations in our country that are located in North Carolina, are listed at current and future risk for wildfires and recurrent flooding, respectively, in a United States Department of Defense report on the effects of our changing climate. And the worst damage has been in eastern North Carolina, where we now are more vulnerable than ever to devastating storms and floods. In September, just 2 years after our state was deluged by Hurricane Matthew, Hurricane Florence slammed into North Carolina. Its powerful winds and storm surge decimated coastal communities and crushed coastal tourism and fisheries. The storm stayed for days, dropping trillions of gallons of rain, inundating communities, drowning crops, and bringing rivers to historic flood levels. Hurricane Florence caused at least $17 billion in damage and tragically took 43 lives. Then a month later, Tropical Storm Michael took additional lives and caused millions more in damage. But for the survivors of these storms, the true cost is incalculable. I've traveled to hard-hit communities and listened to North Carolinians whose lives are changed forever. Tireless first responders who kept showing up to work even though their own homes were destroyed, children who went weeks without schools, families whose livelihoods were washed away. I spoke with an elderly woman who was pulled from floodwaters by a first responder, bringing with her only a few possessions that she could carry. When I saw her in a shelter, I told her how sorry I was. She looked at me and said, "I thank God I'm alive. I thank God for that firefighter who pulled me to safety. And I thank God for these volunteers here in this shelter. Many of them have had their own homes flooded. I'm going to make it." Well, as governor of North Carolina, I have a responsibility to help her make it. I have a responsibility to keep all of our people safe. I've told them we have to do everything we can to rebuild our state smarter and stronger, and we're pursuing unprecedented recovery and resiliency plans to help North Carolinians get back on their feet. We're also making a difference together. I'm pleased that members of our congressional delegation and federal agencies are helping provide meaningful relief to North Carolinians hit hard by the storm, and I look forward to continuing to work together with you on the federal appropriations process. But when storms are becoming more fierce, it's not enough just to pick up the pieces. We must take action to prevent this kind of devastation in the future. I urge Congress and all of our federal partners to match the level of determination brought to recovery efforts in our fight to reduce the effects of climate change. We in North Carolina are doing our part to address those effects. I've signed an executive order that sets a goal for our state to achieve a 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2025. North Carolina is second in the country in solar energy, and my order directs more use of renewable energy. It also orders state agencies to begin using more zero-emission vehicles in our motor fleet. It orders a clean energy plan and better state building efficiency. It also directs our State Department of Commerce to grow our strong, clean energy economy by supporting the expansion of clean energy business, service providers, and companies with commitments to using clean energy. In 2017, I ordered that North Carolina join the United States Climate Alliance, a bipartisan group of states focused on reducing our pollution and protecting our environment. And while local and state action is critical, federal partners must join us in taking action to protect our people from the growing harm of climate change. We need federal legislation and regulations that promote emission reductions, preservation of forests, marshes, barrier islands, and other national infrastructure. We need federal leadership to work with global partners to fulfill and strengthen our international agreements. We need consistent federal action that meets the urgency of our global climate problem. Our communities, our economy, and our future depend on it. Thank you very much.
Very much, Governor, much appreciated. Let me now turn to Governor Baker for your testimony. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva and Ranking Member Bishop, for those warm, welcoming remarks. And I want to thank the members of the committee for being here as well and inviting me to testify on the approach that Massachusetts has taken to deal with the very real challenge associated with climate change. In Massachusetts, climate change is not a partisan issue. While we sometimes disagree on specific policies, we understand the science and know the impacts are real because we're experiencing them firsthand. Shortly after I took office in January of 2015, the snow started falling hard, and it didn't end for months. Last winter, we saw 4 major nor'easters, setting record flood levels and causing significant damage to natural resources and property. Rising temperatures have led to warmer winters, impacting weather-dependent industries like skiing and agriculture. Climate change is also warming our coastal waters and threatening some of the nation's most important commercial fisheries. While many of these challenges are not new, they are more frequent and more damaging than before. While rising temperatures and warmer winters have impacted weather-dependent industries like skiing, local businesses like Berkshire East have adapted to these challenges by diversifying their business to include non-winter activities, which now account for 60% of the mountain's revenue. Berkshire East has also become the first ski mountain in the world to be 100% powered by renewable energy. The magnitude of the impacts from climate change requires all of us at the federal, state, and local levels to work together. That's the path we've taken in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, via bipartisan legislation, was one of the first states in the nation to establish a long-term requirement to reduce carbon emissions by at least 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, while also setting interim targets. We're well on our way to reaching our 2020 goal of a 25% reduction in emissions. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a cap-and-trade program encompassing large electric generators across 9 Northeast states, also provides a stable policy to reduce emission and allow states to invest in cost-effective energy efficiency programs. The investments from this initiative have saved ratepayers across the RGGI states an estimated $8.6 billion. We've also developed regional partnerships with New England states, the Canadian provinces, and the federal government. Utilizing the comparative strengths of different regions allows us to obtain competitive pricing on projects like hydropower from Quebec. In 2016, we competitively bid and selected an offshore wind project on a federal lease area that will save ratepayers money over the next 25 years. This would not have been possible without our partnership with the federal government, and I applaud Congress for providing a predictable investment tax credit for this industry, and also the Trump administration's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management for working with us to quickly review the project and build a new industry here in the U.S. off our eastern shores. We've also been preparing for the ongoing impact of climate change. Our administration recently completed a state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan. Leveraging Federal Emergency Management Agency money, the plan is the first in the nation to fully integrate federal hazard mitigation planning requirements with a proactive approach to addressing the impacts of climate change. Our administration's also sought to work closely with our local communities. Our Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program provides grants and technical assistance to cities and towns so they can assess their vulnerabilities and plan for and implement climate change adaptation projects. Importantly, this program allows communities the flexibility they need to design solutions that work for their unique circumstances. Based on our experience in Massachusetts, I'd like to share 4 themes that I believe will help further reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase resiliency across the country. First, states and local communities need support from the federal government. Many federal initiatives are only available after a disaster occurs. Incentives similar to our MVP program would help communities address resiliency issues before the next disaster. Expanding programs like FEMA's new Resilient Infrastructure grants and increasing funding available to states would accelerate existing efforts and galvanize new ones. Bipartisan interest in infrastructure funding also holds tremendous promise to not only repair and modernize our infrastructure, but also make it resilient to changes in weather. Federal infrastructure legislation should incorporate consideration of climate change emissions, vulnerability, and design standards that reflect that changing climate. Both state and federal governments also need to develop public-private partnerships to bring private sector dollars into our communities while leveraging the knowledge and strategic thinking the private sector can bring to this challenge. Second, we need strong federal leadership and a bipartisan vision on climate change that prioritizes practical, market-driven, and cost-effective solutions while affording states the flexibility to design strategies that work for their unique challenges. We believe it's essential for the federal government to create a target with respect to emission reductions that can vary by state or region. In our state's experience, setting an aggressive target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions provides the foundation for clean energy policy, sends a clear message to industry, and enables long-range planning. Third, strong federal leadership should also include making impactful investments in research around both emission reductions and climate change adaptation. Federal research and development gave us the internet and GPS, technology that has changed our lives forever. I believe the federal government could bring its resources to bear on developing the next breakthrough battery cell or other technological advances that could help dramatically reduce emissions and radically transform our energy future. Fourth, the federal government should incorporate climate risk and resilience in future federal spending and planning decisions to ensure taxpayer dollars are used wisely. Our own Boston Harbor Islands, managed through a partnership between state and federal government and a nonprofit, are already threatened by rising sea levels and storm surges. Governors around the country are seeing and responding to the effects of climate change in our states and communities. This is not a challenge any one of us can solve alone. We need collective action from federal, state, and local governments working with the private sector to aggressively reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the changes that are already in motion. I want to thank this committee for the invitation to speak, and I thank my colleague, Governor Cooper, for joining me here today. We've submitted written testimony which goes into more detail than my oral remarks, and I look forward to working together on this challenge, and I'm pleased to answer any questions from the committee.
Thank you very much. Recognize myself for a couple of questions, governors. Let me just get this out of the way. First of all, do you believe that there is any legitimate scientific debate over whether human-induced climate change is occurring as we speak?
No.
Both of you.
Oh, yes, based on the way you asked the question.
No, I do not. There is overwhelming scientific consensus that that is the case.
What he said.
Some people argue, though, on that point, and on that consensus of opinion, that that although we know it's happening, that humans are a major contributing cause to it, that there's no way to stop it, or that it will be far too expensive to even try. It's a point of view, it's a reaction that you hear. Your comments on those 2 points, that it's...
Well, I guess I'd say this. First of all, the Northeast United States, when I was a much younger person, had a huge issue with acid rain, which was mostly coming from the Midwest. And that was a big problem. It was an environmental issue. There was a lot of debate and discussion about it, but a combination of federal and state policies over time basically solved it. And if you look at what was done with respect to policy at the federal and state level with regard to the ozone layer, while there's still repair going on there, the ozone layer is in far better shape than it was 30, 35 years ago. Pretty clear indications that you can make a difference on big issues with policy. And with respect to affordability, I come back to the procurement that we just did on offshore wind and the hydropower procurement we did, which involves hydropower from Quebec. The price points on both of those initiatives, each of which are worth, hundreds of megawatts of resource to Massachusetts families and businesses, both came in at price points that over time are going to be more cost-effective than it would have been to use traditional resources. So I think the bigger issue here is, are you willing to sort of head in that direction, be practical, chase cost-effective opportunities, and recognize that that there are ways to get from here to there. And the final thing I'll just mention about this, if you have farmers or fishermen or resort operators or foresters in your communities and in your districts, I promise you, they are worrying about climate change all the time. And whether it's the greenhouse gas emission issue or the resiliency issue, they have major challenges that we should all be taking seriously, or we are going to put them all in very significant harm's way over time.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, we can't afford not to take urgent action to fight climate change. It is not too late, but it soon may be. That's why we need to take significant action. And everyone's concerned about cost, but can we afford not to do this? And when you look at cost and profits and jobs, a move to a clean energy economy brings with it significant jobs. It brings a significant economic boost. People may be surprised to know that North Carolina is #2 in the country in solar energy. How did we get there? Well, we forced the utilities to begin using more renewable energy, and we set a renewable portfolio standard for our utilities. We also took steps to limit our own coal-fired plant emissions in North Carolina. So what has happened is that we have grown this solar energy economy and clean energy economy in North Carolina to the point where it has political support from both parties because of the jobs that it has brought to the area, and now it is competitive in cost. So a nudge from state government, a nudge from the federal government, like you've done with tax credits, can move something in the right direction so it becomes part of the economy. And I think at the end of the day, in moving to a clean energy economy, we're going to save a lot of money in healthcare costs. We're going to save a lot of money for these billions of dollars that our states are asking for the federal government to deal with climate change effects from flooding and from snowstorms. We're going to make a positive difference if we do this. We've got to get moving fast. We've taken some small steps. Our states are working very hard to do what we can, but this needs to be a partnership, and we want to work with you.
With the time I have left, another argument people use to excuse the federal government from taking action is saying that we can innovate our way out of it, that there is a technological fix over the horizon that we need to find, and that while innovation is important, do you believe that, and that's an excuse to say we don't need any new laws, we don't need regulations, we don't need incentives, we're going to technologically innovate our way out of this. Do you believe that that innovation in and of itself is enough?
You know, innovation is happening right now with battery storage and other technological leaps, but you have to make it economically feasible. And state, local, and federal government working together can help to push that along. Yes, it's going to require innovation for us to fight climate change and to significantly reduce our greenhouse gases, and it is a process. But I think that federal help, I think stopping the rollbacks that are occurring right now at the federal level, particularly when it comes to the Clean Power Plan and automobile emissions, we don't need to go backward in that area, and we need to encourage innovation and technology to help move us forward.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Mr. McClintock for any questions you might have for the governor, sir.
By the way, Grijalva, it's okay. You can take your extra 2.5 minutes out of my time.
I intended to, sir.
Okay, fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I noticed in their written testimonies, both governors linked climate change with the catastrophic fires we've had in the West. My district is just southeast of Paradise, California. It encompasses the Sierra Nevada from Lake Tahoe past Yosemite Valley and on into Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. Last year, wildfires burned nearly 2 million acres in California. That's nearly 8 times the average annual loss of 250,000 acres that we experienced during the last half of the 19th century. But if you go back farther into the pre-Columbian period, scientists estimate that wildfires destroyed between 4.5 million and 9 million acres per year. The Camp Fire recently burned 153,000 acres. It wiped out the town of Paradise, claimed 86 lives. But in 1910, the Big Burn in Idaho and Montana burned 3 million acres, wiped out 7 towns, and killed 87 people among a far smaller and sparser population. Well, what happened in the intervening time is that the U.S. Forest Service was established, and it began actively managing our forests, removing excess timber before it could choke off the forests and die, and we actively suppressed brush on burned lands and on brush lands. But in the 1970s, Congress imposed a series of environmental laws that subjected federal land management to endlessly time-consuming and ultimately cost-prohibitive environmental regulations. As a direct result, timber harvested from federal lands has declined about 80%, while acreage destroyed by fire has increased proportionally. Typical acre in the Sierra can support about 80 mature trees. The current density is over 300. A single fully grown tree can draw 100 gallons of water from the soil on a hot day. Drought can quickly kill overcrowded forests, and it has. And the problem is climate change doesn't explain the dramatic difference between private forests that practice active forest management and the federal lands that don't. The boundary lines can often be very clearly seen from the air because of the condition of the forests themselves. Green, thriving, private forests grow right up to the boundary line, and on the other side, the forests are morbidly overgrown and dying. I think it's quite clever of the climate to decimate only the lands that are hamstrung by these federal environmental laws. Now, decaying or burning forests make a mockery of all the laws aimed at reducing carbon emissions. Wildfires in the United States pump an estimated 290 million tons of carbon dioxide into the air every year. So, Governor Cooper, if the climate's warming, doesn't it make sense to actively manage our forests so that we can match timber density to the ability of the land to support it so that our forests don't die off and burn?
Well, first, Congressman, we absolutely need to take action to fight climate change.
Would you address my question, Governor, please?
Yes, sir.
My time's limited, so I have to ask you to be responsive.
Yes, sir, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't take steps to be more resilient. My experience in more...
If droughts are becoming more common, doesn't it make sense to provide enough spacing between trees so that snow isn't trapped in dense canopies and evaporates before it can reach the
I
ground?
think any resiliency action that you take needs to be balanced with environmental protection. And I think you have to rely on scientists and regulators to
We
determine
stopped
what
relying
needs to
on
be done.
scientists and forest management some time ago. We've let our forests go to benign neglect, and we're finding out the results aren't very benign. When I visited the Detweiler fire that forced the evacuation of Mariposa almost 2 years ago, the firefighters bitterly complained that they couldn't get environmental permits to cut preventative fire breaks. Governor, shouldn't we be actively suppressing brush buildup and free our firefighters to establish containment breaks before a fire starts?
Congressman, I think if you would join us in our fight against climate change, we could join in finding ways to make our environment more
Why can't
resilient,
we, I mean, if
make
we
our
agree,
forests more
if
resilient.
we agree on at least these common sense steps, why can't we move forward together with them to properly manage our forests so that they are resilient against climate change? Governor Baker, you waxed eloquently over the use of wind power in Massachusetts. But just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal published a scathing editorial on the experience of Falmouth, Massachusetts, that spent $10 million on wind turbines, and it's been a disaster. That small town went deeply into debt to finance them. The townspeople couldn't bear the noise, the constant flickering light as 400-foot windmills turned. Property values plunged 20%, and I wonder how that squares with the bright picture that you painted.
Governor, brief answer. Time run out. If you don't
I'm
mind.
happy. I mean, the question you raised, Congressman, is a good one, and I'll tell you why. I deliberately used words practical and cost-effective in my remarks on purpose. The fact that I believe there are things we need to do with respect to mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency because of what's going on with climate means I also believe we ought to do things well. You know, my father always used to say that there's two things. There's doing the right thing, and then there's doing the thing right. And just doing the right thing, doing it wrong, doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And there are a whole series of issues associated with a well-intended effort in Falmouth that in many respects failed because they didn't make a lot of the decisions with respect to where they sited them and how they sited them that would have made sense. And I think to some extent the success that we had with our deep water wind procurement was in part our ability to learn from a previous experience that we'd had in Massachusetts on a project that never got developed, where people gave a sole source agreement to a single provider in the middle of Nantucket Sound at a very high price because everybody said that was what the market would bear. We put the thing out as a competitive procurement. We said we weren't going to pick anybody unless we got competitive bids. We spent a ton of time with our colleagues in the legislature making sure that the statute that was written gave us the ability to do something that we thought would work. And then we took our time in making sure that the procurement we put out there was a procurement that would give us the answer we were looking for. And we made clear that if we didn't get a good bid, we wouldn't take it. And one of the things we did in our statute that made a big difference was we framed it as a long-term lease. So instead of having the type of contract that typically exists in this environment where people are constantly having to renew it over and over again, we said if you win, you're going to have the time you need to amortize the cost of actually making the investment in the project returned. And because of that consistency in the way we bid it and the fact that it was competitive, we got a great price.
Thank
I
you,
think
Governor.
sometimes when something doesn't go the way it should go, everybody blames the concept. Well, sometimes we just screw up the way we actually implement it, and it
And
makes the concept look bad.
Thank you, Governor. And before I get admonishment on my time management abilities here, if we could keep the questions and the response to that 5 minutes so that everyone that's here will have an opportunity to ask questions. Mr. Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, governors. Governor Cooper, congratulations on your executive order to fight climate change and this tremendous information that can probably be given out to the general public to have them be part of the solution, not just the government, because sometimes rely everything on government. one of the things that I'm looking at is, you stated removing underutilized dams and restoring floodplains. That's a great point that we need here in Congress, especially funding for recycled water and conservation education of the public, to have them understand that we need more water to fight fires and to generally provide for the public, for the communities that we serve. However, there's reticence in this committee to fund recycled water projects. There's used to be a $37 million for 17 western states. I'm asking for $500 million for the future, because we have to prepare for ongoing drought and ongoing fires and everything else. Suggestions, how can we improve public-private partnerships? Two of you.
Well, I think in North Carolina, we're already doing that. We know that we have a lot of areas that are in danger of flooding. We have put advanced flood mapping in place. So now that we know what to evacuate and where areas are going to be flooded, we're taking significant mitigation steps where we're using buyouts, elevations, and even strategic retreats.
Do you inform the general public of your plan so they can be supportive of what you are doing?
Yes, we incorporate what happens with our municipalities. They have to make these tough decisions, particularly about strategic retreat, because we've come to the realization that these floods are going to continue to occur. They're going to be fierce. We need to take our
What about your aging infrastructure?
aging infrastructure, and particularly wastewater treatment plants that are extremely vulnerable to flooding, helping local governments make sure that they are rebuilt and built in a resilient way. I've established the North Carolina Office of Resiliency and Recovery, and what we're doing is working with local municipalities on catch basins, trying to figure out ways to prevent what happens in the future, in addition to our efforts to fight climate change.
Thank you. Governor Baker, what policies can states and city governments put into place to build an inclusive green economy?
Well, I think one of the, to just sort of piggyback a little bit on your previous question to Governor Cooper, I'm a former local official, and I get the reason why it's really important to have local representation and local voices involved in discussions with respect to what happens in their communities. And that's why the vulnerability planning effort that we put together is a municipal vulnerability planning effort, because we want our colleagues in local government and local community leaders to be part of those conversations. And as I've said before, you know, you have 351 cities and towns. They all have, in Massachusetts, they all have different issues with respect to resiliency and adaptation. And we want to make sure whatever it is we do is supported at the local level, because if you don't have local support for it, it's not going to succeed, whatever it is you're pursuing, and it won't be sustained over time.
Yes.
So I agree completely with him on that one.
Part of what the discussion on the forest fires also leads to the fact that we don't fund the agency with enough money to do it. And what with the future threat of more fires, we should have enough funding there to be able to help them do the job they're meant to do. Do you agree?
I agree completely. We spend a lot of money, and we're grateful for it, on recovery. Not enough of that money that's dedicated to states and local governments is allowed to be used for mitigation and resilience. And when you look at a flooded area and see homes that have been elevated, or areas that have already been bought out and now are simply catching floodwater, you see the money that we're saving from the action that we have taken. So I would encourage the Congress to give states more flexibility to use this recovery funding as we rebuild smarter and stronger, as we're trying to do in North Carolina, because we know it's coming again. Well, I'm going to keep saying we've got to fight this emission of greenhouse gases and to fight this overall climate change issue here. But we know in the next few decades that we're going to continue to deal with this severe weather. So we need to be smart about how we rebuild and us being able to use that funding for mitigation and resilience.
Thank you,
is a
Governor.
positive
I
thing.
think we have to cut because the chairman is going to govern me out, but I tell you, 20 years ago, I tried climate change in one of my bills, and I lost it because nobody wanted to deal with climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate, once again, you being here. Governor Baker, I appreciate you being here. Now, look, Ed Markey used to be part of this committee, so at some point off the record, I'd like you to tell me how you got rid of the R's at the end of your vowels. You're doing that very well. And just as a hint, you know, if you try and do ski Massachusetts on your license plates, we've already done that in Utah. We've got copyright on that. Don't try and go there. I do want to ask you a question, Governor Baker. You talked a great deal about working together in a collaborative process, the very essence of federalism. And also, you mentioned how some of the local people who work these issues on the ground know exactly what they're doing. I found in the state of Utah, some of my MES commissioners in rural Utah are those who used to work for BLM, and they are extremely pragmatic about what can and cannot be done. So this is one of those areas that actually is the jurisdiction of this committee.
Yep.
And that is, how can we actually increase collaboration between the federal government and the states? And you guys got to figure out state and local government on your own. That's your jurisdiction. How do we actually increase that collaboration, or is that significant to increase that collaboration?
I think I do think on this vulnerability planning effort, which the Federal Emergency Management Agency has created a program where states and locals can get together and start to work with the feds around doing sort of what I would describe as high-risk analytics and making investments in resiliency and adaptation to deal with places that people are concerned about, so that the next time there is a storm, the next time there is a surge, we don't end up having to deal with the same cleanup that FEMA dealt with the time before. I think that's in some respects one of the best ways for the federal government to work with states, and with locals.
Let me kind of zero in on that. Once again, this is our area of jurisdiction. There are statutes on the books that says we have to collaborate with you. There is nothing in that statute that says what our collaboration actually is. Would there be a benefit of actually trying to list what steps need to be taken in the collaborative process so indeed the states and the federal government are working on the same page, as opposed to you just groveling before us?
Absolutely.
All right.
I think that'd be a great idea.
And that is within our jurisdiction. However, I realize one of the Appropriations Subcommittee is having a hearing on the Anti-Deficiency Act, which has nothing to do with the appropriations process. So eventually, I think we'll get jurisdictional issues worked up in this particular area. Let me talk specifically once again about the concepts that were just brought up with and Ms. Napolitano. She mentioned it before she left. This idea of forest fires and what they need. And maybe when Mr. Westerman has a chance to talk, he can exemplify in this. One of the things that both the Obama and the Trump administration told us is that it's not necessarily an issue of funding that makes it difficult. It's an issue of what kind of powers they have to actually do management practices before the fire season takes place. And the other big issue they also dealt with was cost of litigation, ever-increasing litigation by special interest groups, for which they either backed off what they were attempting to do in order to minimize that litigation, or they were forced to spend their money defending themselves on the litigation. So what they were asking for is greater flexibility in actually managing the land and help in defending themselves against this litigation. I'm making the assumption that when we're dealing with you on the state level, that those issues are also significant, and indeed the experts on the ground who ask us for this kind of help would be saying that same type of thing.
I actually made a note to myself to ask the folks who manage our lands. We have significant land that we manage both actively and passively.
The nice thing is most of your land is state land, and that's great.
What I don't want to do is I don't want to answer this question having not talked to my own people about it, but I will do that and make sure we get back to the committee about it.
And I appreciate that. And actually, Mr. Grijalva, because I won't ask you another question. I'm running out of time with that. But if we can go to the point in the future where Utah has as much federal land as Massachusetts and North Carolina have, I will be tickled pink.
I would love that as long as I get the same amount of skiing that you have in Utah.
Then we'll take some of our extra mountains and put them in there so you can actually ski, and that will include our airflow so we don't have crappy air in the winter. Perfect. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Mr. Costa?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. It sounds like the Governor and the Ranking Member have an opportunity to get great things done here, east-west. But I think this is an important hearing for a lot of reasons, and clearly the impacts of climate change are one of the most significant challenges we face in the 21st century around the world and this country and in our respective states. I know the San Joaquin Valley that I represent has had significant impacts as it relates to the drought conditions, the feast or famine with too much rain and water, and trying to balance our needs. We think about the planet we live in. 200 years ago, we had 1.7 billion people. Today, we have a little over 7 billion, and by the middle of this century, it's expected that we'll have over 9 billion people. And sustainability and the impact that people have on all of our resources is the challenge that we face today. We have people living in areas in which people didn't live before, where they're impacted by these fires, these floods, and these other natural conditions that include hurricanes and tornadoes and other weather events. We in California have done a lot, I think, to try to address the future here in renewable and sustainable sources, as has other states, governors, as you've recommended and told us of your own efforts. I think the earlier comment about better coordination between the state, local, and federal efforts needs to be done. We talk a lot in kind of broad general terms. We don't, I think, focus enough on how we can coordinate together in actually getting something done on the impacts of climate change. And a multi-pronged approach, I think, is critical to that success. Both governors, let me ask you a few questions here. And I'm looking this way because, Mr. Chairman, the clock is blocked here, so for those of us who watch it, make sure we get our time in, it's a little bit of a handicap. As we continue to see, as you testified, the trends on intense weather changes and the impacts there, we have an aging infrastructure. We've been talking about a bipartisan infrastructure measure. How would that, in your respective states, where do you think the best channeling of that funding in transportation and in water infrastructure would best be spent in your respective states?
Well, I think with respect to the issue we're talking about today, which is resiliency, I think the biggest and best opportunity would be around all of the infrastructure that we have that is designed to deal with storms. And much of that infrastructure is nowhere near as significant as it needs to be.
When FEMA comes in, as they have in various parts of the country, and they provide support and recovery efforts, we were just in Puerto Rico last month, and they, under the, I'm trying to remember, Stanford Act or whatever, are only allowed to spend money to what the previous conditions were of that infrastructure.
Right.
That makes no sense. I mean, we ought to be, if we're repairing this once, guess what? More hurricanes are going to come, more tornadoes are going to come, more floods are going to come, and wildfires. We ought to do state-of-the-art restoration, don't you think?
Yes. I mean, yes, we should be thinking about infrastructure going forward in terms of what the consequences will be for bridges, for culverts, for dams, for all of that stuff, based on what people anticipate the significant issues they'll be dealing with will look like. And those are different than the ones people were dealing with 100 years ago, absolutely.
And Congressman, there's a lot of money that comes to states in the wake of disaster, but in the wake of disaster is time to talk about that resilient infrastructure. People were driving around the state of North Carolina for 3 or 4 days after Hurricane Florence because Interstate 95 was underwater.
I appreciate the examples. I got 30 seconds left to both of you, if you can quickly. There's a call, obviously, to provide less stringent environmental regulation in an effort to review and rewrite common sense policies in the light of climate change based on sound science. Is that reasonable to ask?
I didn't understand the.
I didn't understand what
Yeah.
you said, sir.
There's a sense that maybe we need to rewrite environmental regulations in the sense of dealing with these impacts of climate change. Is that reasonable to ask based upon new science?
I think we should continually be updating our rules and our regulations with respect to new discovery and new science. We do it in healthcare, which is the space I came out of in the private sector. We do it in all sorts of areas. Yeah, and I would say definitely here. Yeah.
But I would say we don't want to roll back environmental safeguards that are helping us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and therefore fighting climate change while we're doing that.
Thank you.
Mr. Westerman? I'll be right back.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, and thank you, governors, for being here today. I've had the opportunity to spend quite a bit of time in both of your states. You have beautiful states with beautiful forest and clean water there. And I get accused sometimes of getting too far into the weeds when I start talking about climate and environmental policy. So taking a little bit of a different approach today. I was going to submit this to the record, but I haven't got a hard copy yet. But this is a Dilbert cartoon, and they're sitting around the table, and Dilbert says, "I've invented a cost-effective product to harvest CO2 from the air and turn it into construction material." And his colleague says, "So you invented a tree." And it goes on from there. But, you know, when we look at the climate and how we all want to be good stewards of it, we know that trees are one of the best things on Earth to clean the air, to clean water, and provide good habitat. Governor Cooper, I'm from Arkansas and did a lot of work in your state before I got into Congress, and I actually did a comparison one time of the forested area in Arkansas versus North Carolina, and both states are almost exactly the same, 17 to 18 million acres of forested land in both states, almost the same breakdown of hardwood versus softwood. And there's a difference there, though. North Carolina has one of the most vibrant forest products industries in the country. Even though we have basically the same land mass and the same amount of forest, you all produce a lot more wood products than we do in Arkansas, although our forest products economy is growing and thriving there. So I would, as we look at this issue of cleaning the air, I would like to get your take on how important the forest products industry and forest management is in North Carolina to keeping your forest pristine, which also helps your water quality and your wildlife habitat. And the different kinds of products that are made there and how they may affect the environment. So have you had a chance to get out? I'm sure you have, to see all the varied forest products industries in your state.
Yeah, we do have a strong forest product industry in North Carolina. I think we have to be careful about going too far with it. And I know that our Department of Environmental Quality is looking at additional safeguards that we may need in order to make sure that our forests are protected. I do know, though, that it is an important industry in our state, and we're working hard to make sure that our forests are managed properly, because we know that those natural resources are critically important, not only to clean air, but to our tourism as well in North Carolina.
And I believe about 68% of your forest land is privately held and managed by private owners who are doing that just using good science. And you obviously have a sustainable forest there to be able to continue with the strong forest products industry you got. I know that also North Carolina is one of the leading states in producing wood pellets, and those pellets were driven by the fact that Europe put a tax on carbon coming out of some of their big coal-fired plants, so that drove them to come to the U.S. to buy renewable pellets. How do you think that's affecting the health of the forest in North Carolina and then the global climate as well, being able to use those renewable wood pellets to replace coal in Europe?
There's a concern about the increase of the use of wood pellets in North Carolina. There's a concern about that, yes.
But that was all driven by a mandate from a government saying you had to get the coal out of the plants. So they wanted to replace that with a biofuel. And North Carolina, obviously being on the East Coast and having the abundant forest they have, were a really good supplier to help in Europe to offset carbon emissions over there.
I don't know about that, Congressman. I don't know about that.
And we're going to get a second round of questions? All right. Well, yeah. Real quickly, Governor Baker, the Quabbin in Massachusetts is a great example of how to manage forest and get clean water. Boston relies on that. It's a wonderful system, and I wish we could mimic that other places around the country.
So can I just, two things. We've planted thousands and thousands and thousands of trees since we took office for exactly the reason you just raised. And we have about 4 million acres of forest in a state with 6.5 million acres overall, and about 1 million of them, million acres are managed by the Commonwealth. Planting trees is one of the best. Give us some money to plant trees, we'll plant trees. They also help with soil runoff and a whole bunch of other things as well. And
Mr. Sablan?
the most interesting thing about it has been the relationship between the sportsman community and the environmental community over the importance of forests and wildlife habitat.
I have no control.
Yeah,
Mr. Sablan?
thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Governor Baker and Governor Cooper. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your leadership on climate change. You're both demonstrating in your states. Leading to the question, a little history background is in 2016, our Bureau of Environmental and Coastal Quality developed a 5-year strategy that noted that although the development search in Saipan, one of the islands in the Northern Marianas, would result in dramatic loss of green space and permeable natural surface, particularly in shoreline locations, the political leadership were calling for even less regulatory oversight and for expedited permit processing. And that leads me to no longer be hopeful that my political leadership would join your United States Climate Alliance. But having said that, and having someone mentioned earlier about people being displaced from their homes, over the past 2 years alone, hundreds of thousands of Americans have been forced from their homes, some from as recent as Puerto Rico, Irma and Maria. And in the future, we'll see many more people who need to permanently move because their homes will become uninhabitable, either by rising sea levels or hurricanes and typhoons. The people of the Northern Marianas will be especially hard hit. So what can states and the federal government do in order to more effectively address displacement due to climate change?
Congressman, in North Carolina, I think we have seen it just as you have, that the people who can afford it the least often get hit the hardest in these natural disasters. And one of our problems that we have right now is the issue of affordable housing, being able to find safe, affordable places for people to live. In the wake of this disaster, I think it is helping us put together a plan on affordable housing for across the state. That is something that is going to require public-private partnerships and investments in trying to get developers into making sure that more affordable housing is constructed in areas that are not in floodplains and in danger of being destroyed during these disasters. It is a human tragedy, and I look forward to your ideas, and we certainly can provide you with some of ours on how we do that.
Yeah, Governor Baker.
I would just get back to the question Congressman Costa asked about rebuilding to the standard of what it was before. I mean, clearly we need to be taking a much more forward-looking approach to the way we handle that stuff, because building to the standard that existed before will be nowhere near as resilient as you need to be to deal with many of those issues.
And I agree with you, Governor Baker, because where I come from, the Northern Marianas, we just had a super typhoon, I think the second largest in US history. And we're not actually a wealthy community. So what took people, years to build as their homes were destroyed, demolished. And so FEMA has, inspections, some of them got awarded $6,000, and so they were made an offer. We can take you and move you to another location away from the Northern Marianas until you can get your structure rebuilt. The $6,000 is going to take care of 20% maybe of the cost of the building, if at all. And so that person, this family will move and probably never come back. And, from a place where our population is very little over 50,000, we need all our people to remain at home. But it's not. And so, yeah, I agree. FEMA encourages this relocation. My time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time. Governors, I want to thank you very much for being here. Governor Cooper, I know that I'm from Louisiana. We sent many volunteers and rescue teams to your state.
Thank you, sir.
Following, I'm trying to remember, Chris, Matthew, Florence, Michael, a number of storms you've had in recent years. I've been praying for y'all and working closely with your delegation. Two things real quick. You mentioned some of these resiliency measures on, I think it was October 3rd, the President signed the Disaster Recovery and Reform Act into law. That law that we work closely with your delegation in putting together does provide some additional flexibility in dollars on more resilient reconstruction to where we're not rebuilding the same things over and over again. And I urge you to take a look at that next. On the duplication of benefits letter you sent to the White House in regard to your recovery, we are working closely. Our governor's done the same thing. We're working closely.
Have you gotten an answer yet?
Blood pressure's going up a little bit, potentially filing a lawsuit, but we'll be working closely with y'all on that. Also spent a good bit of time in Pisgah, Linville, Solly, Bent Creek, a lot of your real jewels over there. You have a great state. Governor Baker, reading about some of the things that your state has done in regard to emissions reduction and climate change. It's interesting. Our states, again, South Louisiana, Massachusetts, very different. I heard you in your testimony talking about ski slopes, and of course the ranking member was discussing that as well. We'd love to have that. We have some asset or resource issues. Ski slopes aren't really conducive to South Louisiana. Some of the top industries in Massachusetts, it's technology patents, venture capital, computing technology, some areas that aren't necessarily licensing, aren't necessarily energy or emissions intensive. My home state of Louisiana, we're one of the top energy producers in the nation, one of the top refiners in the nation, one of the largest petrochemical industries in the nation, one of the largest industrial corridors in the nation. It's a very different economy. Your home state of Massachusetts, according to the Energy EIA, the part of the Department of Energy, they indicated that your state has virtually no oil and gas production. Yet, just within the last few years, your state has averaged about over 1 quadrillion BTUs of fossil fuels being used to just operate your state. Over 1 quadrillion BTUs of fossil fuels being consumed for everything going on in the state of Massachusetts. In Revere, you have one of the 3 home heating oil reserves. Much of your, if I remember right, coal and natural gas, approximately 70% of the energy production in your state is from coal and natural gas. That comes from Louisiana. It comes from other states. How do you reconcile? My home state of Louisiana, we're blessed with natural resources. We're blessed with port systems and have a big industrial corridor. How do you reconcile what you're able to do based on your economy versus the challenges in Louisiana based on what our economy is founded on?
Well, our view on this issue for the better part of the past decade has been to make the kinds of investments that can either reduce our draw on energy when we produce productivity, or continue to redefine our source points for energy generally. And if you look at the last 10 years, or even go back before that, maybe the last 20, we've had significant increase in our gross state product. We've had modest population growth. We've had modest increase in number of vehicles miles driven. We've had and a 20% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions over that same period of time. And the energy draw generally has been flat over the same period because we've gotten more productive about how we actually use energy. And I think in some respects, that's one thing that we haven't really talked about at all today. One of the biggest and best opportunities we all have with respect to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions generally is energy efficiency. Our Mass Save program.
And Governor, I agree. I need to reclaim my time because I'm about to run out right now. But I do appreciate that y'all have taken steps. I do. But I also think it's important to recognize that states in some cases are fundamentally differently. Years ago, I calculated the amount of energy that Massachusetts consumed, and I think it was 24 times more energy than they produced. And so you built 3 LNG terminals. A lot of energy is coming in from Louisiana and other states. Mr. Chairman, I want to ask to insert in the record 2 things. Number one, it's interesting. It's a letter asking the president to increase global oil production, And that letter is signed by Senators Cantwell, Schumer, Menendez, and Markey. Secondly, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record a statement that shows the average electricity prices for each state, indicating the state of Massachusetts has electricity prices that are usually the top or the second top in the continental United States, more than double that of the state of Louisiana.
Thank you. Without objection?
Thank you. Yield back.
Also insert in the record, NOAA just released their recap today for the U.S. and global climate for 2018. A couple of highlights in that release, in that report. 2018 was the 4th hottest year on record for our planet, falling behind only 2015, 2016, and 2017. In 2018, the United States was warmer than average and the wettest in 35 years. 2018, there were 14 weather and climate disasters, each with damages over $1 billion, total cost $91 billion. And this is a report that was released as of today by NOAA, and would want that entered into the record as well.
Are you asking for objection?
Without objections, I hope.
I'll say.
Mr. Huffman?
No, Mr. Westerman has something for the record too, maybe?
Yes.
While we're submitting for the record, I would like to submit this Dilbert cartoon to the record. It explains the photosynthetic process.
Mr. Chairman, that's one of the more substantive submittals I've seen from the others.
That one will be framed. Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. It's so important that we have an honest conversation about climate change. And while Ranking Member Bishop wondered where this is heading, obviously it's too early to say which policy prescriptions and solutions this committee may eventually support, but you have to begin with the kind of conversation, science-based, fact-based, policy-based, that we're having in this room. And what better way to have it than this bipartisan duo of governors? I'm struck in listening to your testimonies that when honest people simply listen to the facts, listen to the science, and try to solve problems for those they represent, the party labels kind of melt away and we just become problem solvers. That's refreshing. This committee and this Congress need to hear more of that. This country needs to hear more of that because, frankly, I think America is tired of the shrill, fact-free partisan food fight that has tended to be what they see when we talk about climate change. So thank you both so much for being here. Governors, I want to ask you about offshore drilling. You know that the Trump administration has proposed issuing new leases for offshore drilling that would potentially affect each of your states. You might say that they want to make your state's economies look a little more like my friend Garrett Graves' economy in Louisiana, which is still reeling in many respects from the BP oil spill. What does new offshore drilling represent from your perspective? Is it a threat? What would it do to the coastal economies of your states?
North Carolina says not off our coast. We oppose seismic testing. We oppose offshore drilling. We have too much invested in our tourism economy, in our commercial and recreational fishing economy, in our ports. We cannot tolerate a disaster of epic proportions which could occur. So we have continued to file comments, we have stated our opposition, we have met with federal authorities, and will continue to oppose it in North Carolina, just like over 200 bipartisan local governments have passed resolutions opposing offshore drilling off of the North Carolina coast.
Governor
There's
Baker.
pretty unanimous support for not drilling off the coast of Massachusetts as well, for many of the same reasons. We have one of the most important fisheries in the United States. The New Bedford scallop fishery is more than $1 billion. I think it's the largest from a dollar basis of any fishery in the U.S. We also have demonstrated that the best and biggest opportunity we believe for offshore energy activity is around deep water wind. And just to put a point on that, we put our bid out. We took the best of the bids that we got. Rhode Island took one of the bids, Connecticut took one of the bids, and New York and New Jersey and Virginia and Delaware all of a sudden got very interested in deep water wind when they saw the price points on the procurement that we had negotiated. And the federal government, the Bureau of Energy Management, put a series of federal leases out on federal waters to see what kind of bids they would get on those, and they got tremendous bids on that. And I think if we're looking for a way to grow energy resources on the East Coast, my view would be let's do the deep water wind, which I believe has huge potential. But the tourism industry, the fishery industry, there are a lot of really good reasons not to be doing offshore drilling.
We've never heard of a catastrophic wind spill off our coast, so that seems like a prudent course. Governor Baker, you referred a little bit to this when you talked about climate change's impact on your fisheries, and this is something you do very much have in common with Louisiana. You have a thriving and very vibrant commercial fishing industry. But I understand that the Gulf of Maine is one of these hot spots for ocean warming. It's warming much faster than most other parts of the ocean. Could you speak to what that's doing to the movement of these fish that have historically been there, how that might impact the seafood industry that you represent in coastal fishing communities?
Well, if you think particularly about cod and lobster, which are probably two commercial fishing industries that are as identified with Massachusetts and Maine as any you're going to find. In fact, there's a cod that's actually hanging on the wall in our State House of Representatives chamber because that's considered to be kind of the
sacred. Huh?
Yes, exactly. And that cod fishery is moving north, and the lobster fishery is moving north as well. We're all very concerned that as the water continues to warm in the Gulf of Maine, it could have huge implications for the shellfish industry as well. It's a very big problem, and it's one that you don't have to project out. It's already happening, and it's there, and you can see it in the data, and you can see it when you talk to any of the folks who are part of those fishing communities.
Thank you both for your leadership. I yield back.
Thank you, and I want to thank the panelists,
To be respectful of the governor's time, we probably have, and for the rest of my colleagues, they're gracious enough for an additional 10 minutes, maybe if we can, and then we're at that hard time and we will have to end at that point.
Thank
So
you, Mr.
apologize.
Chairman. In my 10 seconds, I'd like to talk about the speed by which we move towards zero carbon economies. How would, in your experience, and you both have stated in your testimony that you set targets for the reduction of greenhouse gases. Can you share with us some of your thoughts about what we can do at the federal level in setting targets, and what are the obstacles you receive or you found in doing this? How far can we go? Because I'm leading towards what's the balance between a regulatory approach and an incentive market-driven approach? Can they complement each other? Or should we just have one versus the other?
We've set a goal in North Carolina of a 40% reduction by the year 2025, and one thing we know it's going to take a balanced approach. For example, our renewable portfolio standard, we're making requirements of our utilities to increase their renewable energy production. while at the same time we're doing things to encourage zero-emission vehicles, energy efficiency. I think it's got to be a combination of all of the above. One thing I do know is that the United States needs to be a world leader again in this issue. And anything that you can do from a federal perspective to make that happen, we would appreciate it. Our 20-state climate alliance represents about 47% of the population of the United States and a little over half of the gross domestic product. So we do have a strong voice that we want the United States to be a leader in this again. And anything that you can do legislatively from your bully pulpit to make that happen is greatly appreciated. It's absolutely necessary.
And I'd say a couple things. One is I do think the most important thing is to establish long-term goals and objectives because that helps the private sector plan. The second thing I would say is that the goals and objectives can vary from region to region, and I think that, back to the Louisiana versus Massachusetts issue, that's a legitimate issue. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Coalition that we put together with the northeastern states around electricity and energy production has been incredibly effective at reducing greenhouse gases through energy production, and we are currently talking to the same states about doing something in transportation, which I believe will have similar implications for nudging people and encouraging people to move to zero-emission type vehicles over time. And as I said in my remarks before, our economy has continued to perform even as our actual energy use has stayed completely flat and our greenhouse gas emissions have gone down. And I think one of the things that's important here is we have created state-based incentives to encourage our utilities and to encourage our businesses to head in this direction. And we've got about 100,000 jobs now in Massachusetts that are related to the green economy, getting back to the point that Governor Cooper made previously, which is even in Massachusetts, the solar industry has been very successful at finding a path forward, and we are now pairing solar investments with storage. And that's another area where the federal government could play a big role. I mean, storage has tremendous potential, and it has tremendous potential on both price and on environmental issues. The time we typically burn the most environmentally dangerous fuels at the highest price is when it's really cold out or really hot out, and we're paying a ton for what we get, and most of the time it's our most environmentally dangerous sources. And I think storage is a big opportunity to do something about that, and that's a place where the feds could really play a big role.
I just want to say one thing. Thank you for that. I think there are a lot of, I represent the port area of Long Beach, Los Angeles part. We are the largest complex. We've reduced our greenhouse gas effect by 80% and had the greatest economic growth because of that. Well, so there are a lot of models out there. The last thing is, I think that there are regional differences. I am glad that Representative Graves mentioned it, the difference between Louisiana and Massachusetts. You pointed that out. I think the transition to a green economy, which we're doing, and green energy is going to have to deal with that, the transition in workers and resources to different regions. And I think it's important that he at least mentioned it, even though I think we have the differences of opinion on how we reach that goal.
I mean, I've always been, Texas is a very big oil and gas state. It also is a very big wind and solar state. It's a big energy state, and I wonder if that's one of the ways we could think about some of these issues going forward.
Mr. Cox?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Governor Cooper, Governor Baker, for being here today. Every day when I come to work for the people of California's Central Valley, I think about how what we do is going to affect their lives, particularly in these rural communities that I represent. And while it's clear as day that climate change is real, according to the National Climate Assessment, rural communities in particular face more challenging obstacles responding to climate change because they're so highly dependent on our natural resources. And certainly in California, we've seen those direct impacts, the heat waves, the fires, the droughts. And we all know it's only going to get worse unless we do something about it. But my particular concern and interest And to you, Governor Baker, because I know that you worked in the healthcare industry, is really the linkage between climate change and public health, and particularly public health, how it's going to affect our rural communities.
I think the two things I'd speak to on that, the first is obviously the air quality issue, which Congressman Bishop mentioned before. There are definitely air quality issues associated with climate, and those air quality issues translate into issues around asthma, emphysema, and other both acute and chronic conditions that are associated with that. The second thing I'd say with respect to the rural piece is the rural communities generally have difficulty not just with climate, but with access to what I would describe as sort of modern and sort of standard operating procedure technology that you see in other places. I mean, one of the biggest things we have been working on in Western Mass, which has many hill towns and many rural communities, is broadband. Which is a really big issue in terms of economic development and sort of just future capacity to support and serve the people who live in those communities and provide jobs and economic opportunity. And I think in many ways, the strategy around rural communities needs to be about a lot of things, one of which relates to energy and to climate, but there are a lot of things we should be doing with rural communities because they have very different issues that they need to worry about.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the comments regarding the air quality. The San Joaquin Valley is the worst air quality basin in the nation, and it's not getting any better. It's such a shame that we get to see the mountains once or twice a year, right, after a nice rainfall. But, and Governor Cooper, I don't know if you had...
When we in North Carolina and we forced the Tennessee Valley Authority to significantly reduce coal-fired plant emissions, there was a demonstrable positive effect on public health. That matters a great deal. And from the rural perspective, farmers are getting hit hard by the effects of climate change. And they know it, and you hear from them, because in North Carolina now, we have made a significant state appropriation to get some immediate help to our farmers, many of them hit by flood after flood, storm after storm, who are now beginning to make the decision, this is just not worth it. It is not worth it to be in this business. That should be a frightening result, not only for my state, but for the rest of the country and the world, for that matter.
Amen. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the rest of the time.
To the governors, our appreciation. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Mr.
Members have up to 3 days to submit questions that we will forward to you, and if you'd be gracious enough to respond to them, particularly the members that didn't have an opportunity today to ask questions or make comments and have a dialogue with you. Thank you for that, Mr.
Chairman,
Bishop.
can I just say one last thing? I will be actually asking some questions as well to you, specifically on Mr. Huffman's response or questions on offshore drilling, that if you think the governors or the states has a right, or at least a say in what happens on federal waters off your shores, and if your answer is yes, then I'm going to wonder why my governor doesn't have a right and a say on federal lands within my state.
Yeah.
Anything short of that is hypocritical, and that issue is something that's the jurisdiction of our committee.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
governors.
Appreciate it.
And very much appreciated, and thank you for initiating this very important discussion and solution seeking here in this committee. With that, let me invite the second panel up, and we'll begin then. And I'll begin the questioning with Mr. Goose, the members that didn't have an opportunity for the second panel. Okay? Senior members? Let me resume the meeting and welcome the second panel. Let me introduce the second panel. We have Ms. Elizabeth Yeampierre, the Executive Director of UPROSE, Ms. Nadia Nazar, Co-founder, Co-Executive Director of Zero Hour Movement, Dr. Kim Cobb, Professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences and the Director of the Global Change Program and the Georgia Institute of Technology, Ms. Paula DiPerna, Special Advisor, CDP North America, Reverend Lennox Yearwood, President and CEO of Hop Caucus, Mr. Derek Hawley, President of Reaching America, and Dr. Judith Curry, President of Climate Forecast Applications Networks. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes. Your entire statement will be part of the hearing records. I explained the lights. Yellow means you have a minute. Red for the sake of everybody having their questions and additional time to engage with the witnesses today. We would hope that you would stop at that point. And I want to thank the chair. Let me begin with Ms. Nazar. Your 5 minutes. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it, and looking forward to your comments and your perspective. So,
The mic's not on.
Thank you for inviting me to be here today. I would first like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Piscataway Indian Nation, an indigenous tribe. My name is Nadia Nazar. I'm 16 years old, and I'm a junior in high school in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm an artist and environmentalist. I've dedicated my time and efforts to the community and animals on this planet since I was 12 years old. I am a founder of the youth-led climate organization Zero Hour. We say this is Zero Hour because this is Zero Hour to act on climate change. In fact, Zero Hour will soon launch a nationwide campaign for youth to educate their peers about climate justice. Climate change has already impacted my future. Scientists say we will be at irreversible climate chaos by the year 2030 if we don't drastically reduce our emissions right now. I will be 28 years old in 2030. Our world is already experiencing the impacts of global warming, and living conditions will only get closer and closer to the extremes. Humanity has pushed this planet to the edge, and from my view, it seems that few in the policy and political world are paying attention to the consequences of our actions over the generations. The climate crisis exacerbates problems that are already prevalent, especially in developing nations. Clean water, a vital element to life, is becoming even more scarce. Extreme weather and natural disasters are now the norm, creating new crises against vulnerable populations. The U.S. is historically the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, but those who are facing the most severe consequences are the people in developing countries and those in lower-income communities. People in poverty have less access to resources needed to survive when climate extremes take place. Marine life, such as sea turtles and whales and other species, are facing a mass extinction because of the warmer ocean waters that we humans have caused. My community in Baltimore depends on the Chesapeake Bay. These warming waters will not only harm future generations of my community, but it will also harm generations around the world that rely on bodies of water for their livelihoods. It seems here in Washington, the policymakers have for far too long put the interests of fossil fuel corporations and other carbon-emitting industries over the health and prosperity of the people, the wildlife, and this planet. The lives of my generation have been disregarded for far too long. You should put the interests of your future generations first, not just because it is the right thing to do, but because many of us have the right to vote in just a couple of years. We care about clean air and clean water, and we'll be voting for those who want to address climate change head on. Some of my friends say they don't want to have children because they're worried about the kind of lives they would have to live on a warming planet. In the future, asthma rates will be higher, there will be less access to food, and more extreme natural disasters and weather will occur, all due to climate change. Climate change not only threatens the future of my generation, but it continues to displace and kill people. My family in Kerala, India, experienced the floods that occurred there this past summer. These floods displaced approximately 800,000 people and killed 483 people. Around the same time, my friends in Ellicott City, Maryland, experienced floods that caused landslides and infrastructural damage in a historical city. Climate change has been happening. Climate change is happening. Climate change will continue to happen. Climate change is my future unless you do something about it right now. My generation includes your children and your grandchildren. I see climate change as an issue that connects everyone and everything on our planet. This is not just about changes in the weather. It's about these changes that will impact and harm populations all around the world. If there's no food because plants can't grow due to extreme drought, that can cause war. And the most vulnerable populations oppressed by racism, the patriarchy, colonialism, and more will be the ones who suffer. These are the people who are so often left out of conversations about the quality of the air and water, about energy, and about how we treat this land. We at 0 Hour believe that not only the voices of the nation's youth have been ignored, but others as well. Women, people of color, indigenous communities, and some of our most vulnerable populations. How can we progress towards an equal and equitable society of justice if we can't listen to those who make up our country? I believe that everyone must work together, united and with compassion on this issue. Those who hold the most power and influence in our society should work with those working in our local communities. I ask of you, Congress, to work with the grassroots climate movement, including the youth, and listen to them in order to bring sustainable change swiftly in time for my generation and I to be able to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you.
Ms. Yeampierre, Executive Director, UPROSE, floor is yours.
Buenos dias. My name is Elizabeth Yeampierre. I'm the co-chair of the Climate Justice Alliance, an intergenerational alliance of more than 68 frontline community organizations, movement networks, and movement support groups rooted in Indigenous, African American, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, and poor white communities living on the front lines of climate change, as well as the dig, burn, drive, dump industries causing the climate crisis. I'm also executive director of UPROSE. It's a women of color-led intergenerational organization founded in 1966, dedicated to environmental and social justice. We're home to the largest gathering of young people of color on climate justice, the Climate Justice Youth Summit. We're located in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, a diverse community of color made up predominantly of people of color and immigrants. We have a poverty rate of nearly 26% above the city average and far above the national average. From a climate perspective, we're an industrial waterfront community exposed to flooding from hurricanes and storm surges, as was the case in 2012 when Superstorm Sandy hit. Like climate change, the conditions of our communities are the consequence of a long history of extraction. We share legacies of fighting colonialism as well as race, class, and gender oppression while advocating for environmental justice. Our communities are the first and most impacted by the storms, fires, floods, and droughts, and are disproportionately burdened by the pollution, poverty, and systemic violence associated with the multinational corporations driving these ecological crises. Puerto Rico is the most recent and drastic example of a land ravaged by corporate extraction, with people left to fend for themselves after years of colonialism, austerity, and neglect. The double disasters of Hurricanes Maria and Irma created an opportunity for disaster capitalists to profit from people suffering in a time of social and economic devastation. The same thing took place in the Gulf South for Black and Indigenous communities after Hurricane Katrina. Climate change solutions must honor human rights and respect frontline leadership through the solutions that are proposed. Elsewhere, the extractive economy continues to harm entire communities, as is the case with uranium mining in New Mexico, which affects over 60 indigenous nations. The Southwest U.S. was declared a national sacrifice zone in the federal energy policy of the 1970s. This means that environmental safeguards were not enforced, thus endangering human life. Drinking water is tainted with uranium and arsenic, and there is a high rate of cancer, heart disease, and lung disease. Uranium mining is a key element of nuclear energy, which is considered renewable energy in most federal clean energy policy initiatives. You can understand why we do not support the use of large-scale biofuel, biomass, mega hydro dams, nuclear energy, or energy derived from burning waste. They are usually developed in our backyards where we live, work, play, and pray, and they do not reduce emissions at the source of extraction, only prolonging any real solutions to the climate crisis. To effectively tackle climate change, we must invest in a just transition. A just transition will not be smooth, but must be just, leaving no worker or community behind. Frontline communities and an economic framework that moves us away from extraction must be at the center of any effort to address climate change. All around the country, there are examples of frontline communities developing projects that engage in innovative infrastructure, further control, and create jobs. Some are at the early stages, while others are ready to be scaled up and replicated. They will benefit more people and communities if there's political will, public investment, and incentives to do so. The fossil fuel industry receives millions in subsidies. Imagine what communities already forging comprehensive solutions to the climate crisis could do with the reallocation of these subsidies. My organization, UPROSE, just recently partnered with the New York City Economic Development Corporation, Solar One, and Co-op Power to create the first community-owned solar cooperative in the state of New York. On a larger scale, we advocate for turning the area's industrial sector into an economic engine able to build for the region's climate adaptation future. Offshore wind alone can deliver power to New York City, displacing the need for dirty power plants. But just as importantly, it would position the city at the center of this emerging industry, driving local economic development. For years in another part of the country, the residents of Highland Park, Michigan, suffered high energy costs and blackouts along with massive flooding. When the municipality was in a financial crisis, the local energy company repossessed 1,000 streetlights, leaving the residents in the dark. Solidarity, a local environmental justice group, and a CJA member stepped in and designed a system for installing solar power lights. Solidarity created a bulk purchasing program that is training residents in the solar installation and weatherization, readying them to step into clean energy jobs. They are using education and organizing to literally make light of a dark situation. Frontline communities know what is at stake. The question is, will legislation aid our communities' future survival or hinder it? I hope for all of our sakes it will be the former. The bottom line is that our communities are not sacrifice zones, and they have been for too many years. Gracias.
Thank you. I thank Chairman Grijalva and Ranking Member Bishop for allowing me to contribute to this important conversation about our nation's future. My message today is simple. The data and the science could not be more clear. It's time to act. There are many no-regrets, win-win actions to reduce the growing costs of climate change. But we're going to have to come together to form new alliances in our home communities across our states, and yes, even in Washington. I know I speak for thousands of my colleagues when I say that scientists all over the country are willing and eager to assist policymakers in the design of data-driven defenses against both current and future climate change impacts. As a professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology for the last 15 years, my research uses samples collected from the remote Pacific to reconstruct past climate variations. Our records are consistent with countless other records indicating that the rate and magnitude of recent climate change dwarf natural climate variability over the last millennium. I love my work, but 3 years ago, I witnessed something that would change my life forever. In 2015, we received funding from the National Science Foundation for a series of field expeditions to document the evolution of a strong El Niño event projected that winter. I had waited 15 years for this scientific opportunity. However, little did I know that warming ocean temperatures 6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than average would kill up to 90% of the coral at our study site. And I had a front row seat to that carnage. 2016 would go on to become the worst global-scale coral bleaching and mortality event on record and the warmest year on our planet since records began. Personally, 2016 was my wake-up call. Unfortunately, the last years brought a number of devastating wake-up calls much closer to home. Hurricanes Harvey, Lane, and Florence decimated entire communities, delivered record-breaking rainfall while Hurricanes Maria, Michael decimated entire communities with their force, including many in my home state of Georgia. The National Climate Assessment, released this last November by a consortium of 13 federal agencies, documents how climate change loads the dice in favor of extreme precipitation events and how warmer oceans fuel larger tropical storms. On the other side of the country, record-breaking wildfires raged across California, linked to prolonged drought and warmer temperatures. The economic toll of these disasters can be measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars. However, their real toll, the vast human suffering left in their wake, is immeasurable. And beyond these deadly extremes, a host of additional climate change impacts represent a growing threat to ecosystems and communities alike. Sea levels are rising with up to 6 feet of global sea level rise projected this century. Drought threatens water supplies across the western U.S. with no end in sight. The oceans are becoming more acidic as excess carbon dioxide reacts with seawater. And as of today, 2018 will officially take its place as the 4th warmest year on record behind 2016, 17, and 15. Climate change impacts are now detectable all across America, and they will get worse. That's the bad news. I'm sure you're ready for some good news, and there is plenty to go around. The good news is that science can help inform measures to help protect communities as well as our oceans, forests, parks, waterways, and wildlife from the most devastating impacts of climate change. Here, early action is essential to the success of these approaches, delivering vast returns on investment. Many jurisdictions, from the local to the federal, have developed a suite of climate adaptation measures informed by rigorous science, stakeholder engagement, and cost-benefit analysis, but we must accelerate these efforts. Towards that end, the National Climate Assessment provides an actionable blueprint for such adaptive measures, including an in-depth assessment of climate impacts on ecosystem structure, function, and services. The other good news is that it's not too late to avoid the most damaging impacts of future climate change. We have the tools, we need to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in doing so, we will enjoy cleaner water, cleaner air, and healthier communities. The rapid expansion of renewable energy across the nation demonstrates a strong appetite for carbon-free clean power. Even so, U.S. greenhouse gas emissions were up 3% last year. The bottom line is that we are running out of time. Comprehensive federal policies are needed to speed the transition to low-carbon energy sources. Top on the list must be a price on carbon, to reflect the true cost of continued fossil fuel emissions and to incentivize consumers, companies, and the market to find the cheapest, most effective means of reducing emissions. With or without a price on carbon, increased energy efficiency is a win-win strategy that can deliver energy cost savings while reducing harmful air pollution. Lastly, there is a strong case to be made that we can deploy our vast forests, grasslands, and coastal marshes in service to natural carbon sequestration. At its most basic level, this means designing strategies to safeguard these environments with their rich carbon reserves in the face of continued climate change. As a climate scientist, I have to wonder, how bad will it have to get for us to recognize that climate change represents a clear and present threat and to act decisively to protect ourselves? I am heartened by recent polls showing that nearly 3 in 4 Americans are concerned about global warming and support a range of policy options to address it. As a mother to 4 young children, I'm inspired by the sea of young people demanding that we not squander their chances for climate stability. I urge this committee to capitalize on the vast trove of climate science findings by 1, protecting our natural resources and the communities that depend on them from known climate change impacts, and 2, using federal lands to advance climate solutions rather than expanding the scope of the climate change problem. Thank you.
Ms. DiPerna?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. And no doubt disclosure information on our CDP platform touches all the states represented on the committee, and I thank you for your service to the nation. CDP North America, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, is a nonprofit that operates for the public good. Today, roughly 500 companies in the United States, including 70% of the S&P 500, disclose to us and through us their quantitative and qualitative information about environmental performance, their environmental performance, and the imperatives they perceive. Our standardized annual information request is signed off on by roughly 500 investor enterprises who represent over $94 trillion in cumulative assets and most of the financial service sector of the world. Our signatories use disclosure as a gauge on corporate strategic advantages and vulnerabilities and a reference for making investment decisions. If you stroll through our data, you would find there more than 15 years of evidence of the doability, desirability, and necessity of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to address climate change, expressed voluntarily by companies themselves, many of whose shareholders are public pension funds, and thus relevant to much of the American people. As for me, you have my full resume, but suffice it to say here that I've seen the climate change issue from 360 degrees, from coral reefs to carbon markets, literally, working closely with both economist Richard Sandor to help and design the world's first integrated cap and trade, the pioneering Chicago Climate Exchange, and with oceans explorer Jacques-Yves Cousteau, seeing the first President Bush twice at the Oval Office to discuss climate change. President Bush signed the United States to the Landmark Framework Convention on Climate Change, to which the United States remains a signatory, even if the U.S. has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and we now stand alone among nations outside the global consensus and also likely missing out on opportunities to use coherent policy, state and local and federal, to maximize jobs creation and future-proof our crumbling infrastructure. Sometimes it is said that American companies are concerned that strong policies will hurt business. On the contrary, companies are quite concerned about climate change itself, and following, I will share with you a few examples from almost all of your districts and states, and probably all, and refer you to my written testimony and other materials of CDP for further details. In Arizona and Colorado, for example, Arizona Public Services, 6,300 new employees serving 1.2 million customers, has said, risks associated with forest fires are not new, but scientists have indicated that as the global temperatures increase, there is a greater risk of drought and a correlated increase in risk and intensity of forest fires. Potential threat is very real. Of course, we've heard very much today about the burning in California. It's not only the trees, the downgrade of most of the utilities in California affects directly American people. The credit rating downgrade is very, very significant, rating companies from stable to negative by Moody's and S&P and Fitch's. In Connecticut, Stanley Black & Decker, employer of nearly 60,000 Americans, has stated, climate change can have potentially devastating impacts on our supply chain should drought or flood occur. In Ohio, American Electric Power, which has 17,500 employees and 5 million customers across 11 states, including Texas, Louisiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia, in their SEC filing has said, climate change risk is considered a major and material issue for AEP. And on the issue of regulatory uncertainty, AEP is on the record as saying, and additionally, in recent years, legal challenges to almost every major EPA rulemaking have added additional uncertainty and cost. While environmental regulations mentioned will have a large impact on our operations, the uncertainty regarding climate change regulation or legislation is a more challenging risk to manage. In Texas, companies such as Chevron, DuPont, and Total have described risks in their disclosure pertinent to the need for storm barrier protection for oil facilities. Florida, Harris Corporation, close to 17,000 employees, is worried that their data centers will be affected as temperatures rise and they lose, quote, ambient cooling potential. On the supply chain front, Johnson & Johnson, based in New Jersey with 134 employees, 134,000 global employees, is worried about climate change, extreme weather, disrupting not only demand for products, but disruptions in manufacturing and distribution networks of vital medicines, and afraid that it will affect the overall design and integrity of our products and operations. Atlanta, Coca-Cola, 90,000 companies, is worried about agricultural products, including sugarcane, corn, and citrus. Coca-Cola has said the affordability of our products and ultimately our business could be negatively impacted. In Nevada, even Caesar's Palace is not immune from climate change. Its parent has said they're virtually certain to see short-term increase in cost due to a shortage of precipitation. Even before the Paris Agreement, we were getting risks on supply chain. And if it wasn't from soup to nuts, it's soup to tomatoes. For example, Campbell's Soup cited water risks and climate change as very significant and of concern, and ConAgra has said, quote, they've seen delayed tomato harvesting due to unseasonably cool weather. Dr. Pepper, of course, is worried about water. It's one of their main ingredients, and has said a portion of our cost of sales, or $2.5 billion, could be at risk through increased costs to our supply chain. I could go on and on. I will not. I know my time is up, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Reverend Yearwood, floor is yours, sir.
Thank you to Chairman Grijalva and the entire committee for having me here today. And thank you to the other panelists for your commitment to solving climate change, especially Love, Zero Hour, and UPROSE. My name is Reverend Lennox Yearwood, Jr. I am the president and CEO of the Hop Caucus, and all of you Republicans and Democrats are invited to be part of the Hip Hop Caucus. That was a little joke there to start off the testimony. But let me get right to it. As Americans, we face challenges head on. Climate change is not a Democrat issue or a Republican issue. It is a human issue. This crisis is complex. It impacts all of us and future generations, and those with the least resources are impacted first and worse. But we know how to solve this crisis. We must make a just transition off of fossil fuels to a 100% clean, renewable energy economy that works for all. Many communities, cities, and states across our country are leading the way on climate solutions. I urge every member of this committee to visit places and people who have gone through climate disasters, and visit communities, projects, and businesses that are implementing clean energy and climate solutions. When you visit these communities, it will become very clear that climate change is a civil and human rights issue. In 1960, 4 African-American college students sat at the Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, to desegregate the South. They were courageous beyond belief in standing up for equality. Today, young people like Nadia across the table from me and across this country are courageously standing up not only for equality, but for our existence. Climate change is our lunch counter moment for the 21st century. Young people are organizing, marching, and coalition building, and they are leading the call for solutions like a Green New Deal. They are doing it because they know that the science on climate change is undeniable, but also because, like all of us here today, they have watched as people have died in Hurricanes Harvey, Maria, Irma, Katrina, and Superstorm Sandy. They have seen the families who have lost everything to fires that have ripped across the West. They have been part of peaceful movements opposing fossil fuel developments led by the Lakota people at Standing Rock and the Gwich'in people in the Arctic Refuge. So the question is, what are you, as members of this committee, going to do? It is my prayer that you call up at least as much courage as young people standing up around the country, and that you act now, and you act boldly and courageously. If this committee and both chambers of Congress don't urgently come together, put the people of this country first, put God first, and put your political party to the side to solve climate change, we don't make it beyond 12 years from now without huge amounts of death, destruction, and suffering. As an officer in the United States Air Force Reserve Chaplain Corps, I had to ponder the unique relationship between military and faith. In the military, we need our faith not only to strengthen us in battle, but we need our faith to guide us to do what is right. We need you to use your faith to guide you to do what is right. If you are approaching climate change or climate as a partisan political issue, your faith is leading you astray. We, the American people, need you to have courage to do what is right. It is your courage. It is your courage. It is your courage that can put our country and the world on the path of solving climate change. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. Thank you, and may God be with you and with us all.
Mr. Holly, floor is yours, sir.
Greetings, Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Derek Holly, President of Reach America, an organization I developed to address complex social issues that are impacting the African American community. We're focused on solutions, not based on right or left-wing views, but what makes sense for a more united America. One of the issues that we do the most work on is addressing and reducing energy poverty. What is energy poverty? Energy poverty exists when low-income families or individuals spend upwards of 30% of their total income on their electric bill. And when that happens, it puts people in tough situations and having to make tough choices like, do I eat today or do I pay the electric bill? Do I get this prescription filled or do I fill up my gas tank? I can't even give the kids a couple of dollars today because I got to pay the electric bill. And for many Americans, particularly in the minority community, we face these challenges every single day. And the community, the African American community, we don't have the luxury to pay more for green technologies. We need access to affordable energy to help heat our homes, power our stoves, and get back and forth to work. And through Reaching America, I've had the opportunity to reach and talk to thousands of African Americans who all talk about one thing: the question of rising cost of energy, along with the fees and subsidies that they have to pay that they don't benefit from, and how they struggle to keep up with it. Now, my passion for energy is deeply rooted. When I first graduated from college, I worked for Norfolk Southern Railroad as a brakeman. And I can couple the cars, I can switch the tracks, I know how to tighten up the brakes and everything. And so I worked at Lambert's Point in Norfolk, Virginia. And our job and responsibility was loading coal ships that transported coal all around the world. So I've always asked myself the question, if our natural resources are good enough for other countries, then why is it not good enough for us right here at home? And in addition to that, my grandfather was a black coal miner in Southwest Virginia. So it's safe to say if it wasn't for the energy industry, I wouldn't be here to talk to y'all today. Now, when the government creates policies, its first priority should be the welfare of the people, especially those impacted the hardest, rather than big business and special interest groups looking for a handout. I'm also a member of Project 21, a national black leadership organization. And in our blueprint for a better deal for Black America, we focus on 10 key areas for reform, including minority impact assessments for new regulations. This would be a major step towards increasing economic opportunities and having input from governors and community leaders, much the same way that qualified opportunity zones were developed, will create a level of trust in communities that never existed before. After all, the government requires environmental impact studies and statements to estimate the effects of projects like roads and buildings on nature. Shouldn't the government act similarly when it comes to how regulations impact the population or a particular market segment? A minority impact assessment would create a list of all positive, all negative impacts proposed regulation would have, and the factors including employment, wages, consumer prices, home ownership, job creation, et cetera. The regulatory impact would then be analyzed for its effect on minorities in contrast to the general population. The bottom line, any policy that contributes to energy poverty is a bad one for low-income and minority communities. Fortunately, our nation has an abundant supply of natural gas that is the solution to our nation's energy questions. Recent polar vortex temperatures last week dropped so low in some areas that windmills couldn't even turn. We have to have a plan B. Natural gas is clean. The U.S. Energy Information Administration reports that almost 2/3 of the CO2 emissions from 2006 through 2014 came from the fuel shifting towards natural gas. Natural gas is reliable, it's efficient, and it meets the needs of our nation's grid. And natural gas is also affordable, and for many Americans, this allows them not to have to choose to keep the lights on and feed their families. So in closing, I'm all for protecting the environment. I'm a licensed captain, had the opportunity to take my boat to Florida and back. The Intercoastal Waterway is beautiful, so I'm all for the environment. However, until we figure out a way to harness the sun and the wind to sustain ourselves, we need to use what we have, especially if it can lower the cost of energy, create jobs, and boost the economy. That's my time. Thank you.
Dr. Curry?
I thank the chairman, the ranking member, and the committee for the opportunity to offer testimony today. I'm concerned that both the climate change problem and its solution have been vastly oversimplified. This oversimplification has led to politicized scientific debates and policy gridlock. My testimony is presented today in the spirit of acknowledging the complexity of the problem and proposing pragmatic ideas that can break the gridlock. Climate scientists have made a forceful argument for a future threat from climate change. Man-made climate change is a theory whose basic mechanism is well understood, but the potential magnitude is highly uncertain. If climate change were a simple, tame problem, everyone would agree on the solution. Because of the complexities of the climate system and its societal impacts, solutions may have surprising, unintended consequences that generate new vulnerabilities. In short, the cure could be worse than the disease. Given these complexities, there is plenty of scope for reasonable and intelligent people to disagree. Based on current assessments of the science, man-made climate change is not an existential threat on the timescale of the 21st century, even in its most alarming incarnation. However, the perception of a near-term apocalypse and alignment with a range of other social objectives has narrowed the policy options that we're willing to consider. In evaluating the urgency of emissions reductions, we need to be realistic about what this will actually accomplish. Global CO2 concentrations will not be reduced if emissions in China and India continue to increase. If we believe the climate models, any changes in extreme weather events would not be evident until late in the 21st century, and the greatest impacts will be felt in the 22nd century and beyond. People prefer clean over dirty energy, provided that the energy source is reliable, secure, and economical. However, it's misguided to assume that current wind and solar technologies are adequate for powering an advanced economy. The recent record-breaking cold outbreak in the Midwest is a stark reminder of the challenges of providing a reliable power supply in the face of extreme weather events. With regards to energy policy and its role in reducing emissions, there are currently two options in play. Option number one, do nothing, continue with the status quo. Or option number two, rapidly deploy wind and solar power plants with the goal of eliminating fossil fuels in 1 to 2 decades. Apart from the gridlock engendered by considering only these two options, in my opinion, neither gets us where we want to go. A third option is to reimagine the 21st century electric power systems with new technologies that improve energy security, reliability, and cost, while at the same time minimizing environmental impacts. However, this strategy requires substantial research, development, and experimentation. Acting urgently on emissions reduction by deploying 20th century technologies could turn out to be the enemy of a better long-term solution. Since reducing emissions is not expected to change the climate in a meaningful way until late in the 21st century, adaptation strategies are receiving increasing attention. The extreme damages from recent hurricanes, plus the billion-dollar losses from floods, droughts, and wildfires, emphasize the vulnerability of the U.S. to extreme events. But it's easy to forget that U.S. extreme weather events were actually worse in the 1930s and 1950s. Regions that find solutions to current impacts of extreme weather and climate events will be better prepared to cope with any additional stresses from climate change and to address near-term social justice objectives. The industry leaders that I engage with seem hungry for a bipartisan, pragmatic approach to climate policy. I see a window of opportunity to change the framework for how we approach this. Bipartisan support seems feasible for pragmatic efforts to accelerate energy innovation, build resilience to extreme weather events, pursue no-regrets pollution reduction measures, and better land use practices. Each of these efforts has justifications independent of their benefits for climate change. These efforts provide the basis of a climate policy that addresses both near-term economic and social justice concerns and also the longer-term goals of mitigation. This ends my testimony. Thank you.
Much, and to the whole panel, our appreciation for your valuable and important testimony. Let me turn to my colleague, Mr. Neguse, for questions.
Well, first, I want to thank the chairman for holding this hearing. It is a breath of fresh air, particularly for us new members who have just joined the Congress, that the Natural Resources Committee is undertaking this important work and that its first hearing is on such an important topic. I would respectfully disagree with Dr. Curry in terms of your framing around the existential nature of this issue. I think climate change is an existential threat. I think of this in the context of being a new young father. I am 34 years old. My wife and I just had our first child, a daughter named Natalie. She's 5 months old. And much of our work here in the Congress is ultimately making sure that the world she inherits is a better one than perhaps the world that we inherited. And one need look no further than the IPCC report and a variety of other studies to just see how catastrophic the consequences of climate change will be for her generation if we don't take decisive action and if we don't do so now. And I can tell you that certainly in my community in Colorado, we are feeling the impacts of climate change already. I have a report here that I'll respectfully ask to be submitted into the record, the most recent report from the Department of Interior with respect to the impacts of climate change in Rocky Mountain National Park. I represent Colorado's 2nd Congressional District, Northern Colorado. 52% of my district is federal public land, and we see very clearly the impacts of climate change in Rocky Mountain National Park and elsewhere. My constituents see it every day. Rising temperatures have led to snow melting faster, which causes increased flooding and erosion and negatively impacts Colorado's fresh water supply, 70% of which comes from our snow. At Rocky Mountain National Park, the studies have shown that temperatures have risen 3 to 4 degrees, significantly affecting the plants and animals that call the park home. I am very excited about the opportunity to take comprehensive, holistic, and significant action to solve this issue. Actions like the Green New Deal, which I support along with several of my colleagues. I've introduced legislation to protect over 400,000 acres of public lands in my state in Colorado so that we can ensure that those lands are not sold to the highest bidder and opened up to oil and gas development and the rest. So at the end of the day, I think this was the defining issue of our time, and I thank the witnesses with respect to their activism in trying to push for common sense solutions that will ultimately protect the planet for all of our children. My question goes to Mr. Hawley. I heard your testimony with respect to energy poverty, I think as you described it, and the issues around affordability. I don't know if you're aware of this. I think you referenced natural gas as being, quote, clean. According to the NAACP's Air Task Force report, African-American communities face an elevated risk of cancer due to air toxic emissions from natural gas development. And over 1 million African-Americans live in counties that face a cancer risk above the EPA's level of concern from toxics emitted by natural gas facilities. So I'm curious how you would respond to that statistic.
My response would be all of our energy sources have some type of downside to them, even coal. We look at the wind.
Well, I would agree with you there, Mr. Hawley.
Right.
Coal certainly has a negative impact, as does natural gas.
If I could finish, sir, if I could finish.
Proceed.
Even the wind turbines this winter, a couple weeks ago, couldn't operate the downside. But we know for a fact that liquid gas, natural gas, is the cleanest way and the most affordable way right now for people in this country.
Well, I'm not sure I understand your comparison of windmills to the toxins and potential cancer risks associated with natural gas emissions. But nonetheless, I will say, I understand that you have written a number of editorials, and obviously from your testimony today, support the development of fossil fuels, coal,
Energy
natural
exploration,
gas.
energy exploration.
And I understand that your organization, Reaching America, that you've utilized that organization to make those views known. Is that a fair?
That's a fair assessment.
I also understand that your organization is a partner with a group called, let's see here, Explore Offshore. Is that correct?
We are a member of that organization, yes.
Okay, and that is a project of the American Petroleum Institute.
Yes, they are associated with them, yes.
Does your organization receive any funding from fossil fuel companies or corporations?
No, we do not.
With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Gomer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm curious, Reverend Yearwood, from your testimony, it sounds like you support the Green New Deal. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Okay. Well, because you'd mentioned your position as a chaplain in the military, and some of us have real concerns about closing every base and cutting our military by 50%, but that's interesting that you support those.
Well, the military has spoken, was one of the key institutions of our government that actually has spoken about the threats of climate change.
Right. And but that's, Green New Deal is going to take care of that by making us basically indefensible with the 50% cut. We will not be able to protect ourselves properly from the threat of Russia, China, or even ISIS from there, but and closing all bases overseas. But that's interesting. But I also I couldn't help as I listened to Mr. Hawley, your testimony. Think back to just a giant here in the U.S. Congress named John Dingell. He was chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee when Democrats took the majority back in January of 2007 through January of 2011. I mean, for 50 years, he and, as I understand, his father had wanted some kind of universal health care, and he was thrilled that he was going to get to chair that into being. But my understanding was the Speaker of the House, now Speaker again, wanted two things out of his committee. They wanted the universal health care bill, Obamacare, and cap and trade. And he made the public statement because that jacks up the cost of energy like you've been talking about. And as you know, the people that are impacted, it isn't the rich. They can afford it. And so he made the statement, the cap and trade bill is not only a tax, it's a great big tax. And of course, the nation's poor were the ones that would be most impacted. But because of his comment, he was fired as chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Mr. Waxman was made chairman, and as he famously said, we not only don't want your input, we don't need your votes, and so he pushed it through. And it never became law. But as you testified, that does come back to mind. And I had a 80-year-old lady say, I am scared. My cost of energy to heat my home is going up. And I was born in a home that only had a wood-burning stove, and I'm afraid I'm going to die in a home that only can afford a wood-burning stove. And I said, I'm really sorry to be the bearer of bad tidings, but probably your wood-burning stove is going to end up being illegal. But it is tragic, and it is the poor that suck it up when we push these kinds of things. So I appreciate your perspective very much. Dr. Curry, let me ask you very quickly, has there ever been any climate change more dramatically than what killed off the dinosaurs?
Well, climate has always varied. Sometimes there are extreme events that may be, an asteroid or comet impact or something like that. But the ocean, volcanic eruptions, there's many sources of natural variability on all time scales. So when you see the climate changing, you can't immediately assume that it's all caused by humans. There's a strong natural.
Do you think we're causing the polar ice caps on Mars to melt?
No.
That's probably the sun, apparently. But my time's running out, but I appreciate all our witnesses. But the comparison of the civil rights effort, that was unconstitutional activity by the government, and it just strikes me so ironic that if the climate change and the Green New Deal comes into law, it's saying we're giving up our freedom and putting all our faith in the government that caused the civil rights violations to begin with. It's just rather ironic, but my time's expired. I yield back.
Well, thank you, Chair, for this opportunity to finally, after many years, have a hearing on climate change. And I want to thank our witnesses, along with our governors who signaled a bipartisan desire to see strong federal action. Let's cut to the chase. The overwhelming scientific consensus has left no doubt that we are facing a climate crisis. And it's long past time to stop undermining science and evidence. The report that we saw this morning from NOAA and NASA shows that the 5 warmest years recorded since 1880 are the last 5 years. This isn't that hard to figure out. Now must be the time to accept reality. This is reality, and we've got to begin focusing on solutions. And I want to thank the young people who are here for leading the way on initiatives like the Green New Deal. We must not wait to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy or energy-efficient buildings or electrify our transportation infrastructure. And I'm from the great state of California, where I've been involved in climate and energy policy for a long time, and I've heard the naysayers every step of the way. But what we've done is we have demonstrated beyond any shadow of a doubt that if you protect the environment and innovate with the clean energy jobs of the future, you will grow the economy at the same time. And our solar industry in California is a clear example of that. We must also not abdicate our global leadership on the issue of climate change or subcontract our energy and environmental policies to a handful of big polluters who ignore science and common sense. And we must not sit by as unprecedented climate change impacts the health and safety and economy of our communities. Now, I'm confident that a strong majority of the American people are with us, and even a strong majority of my colleagues in the House and Senate. The question is whether we have the courage to act on climate, and this hearing is just one step of many that we're going to need to take in that direction. The transition to a more sustainable future has been my life's work, and it'll be a critical aspect of my service in Congress. I hope that we can put politics aside, if even for just a moment, and focus instead on science and evidence and our future. And like my friend Mr. Neguse, I've got 2 young children at home, and this is about leaving the planet better for them than how I found it. With that, I actually do have a couple of questions for Dr. Cobb. Dr. Cobb, I want to thank you for your work. We've seen numerous studies over the past few months that climate change is wreaking havoc on ecosystems, and that we've potentially lost 2/3 of all species that were on the planet before the Industrial Revolution. So why is the preservation of biodiversity so important for our resiliency to climate change, and what steps can we take to preserve biodiversity, particularly as the Natural Resources Committee?
Thank you for that question, the opportunity to address that. I think I made clear in the testimony that I provided that any number of indicators of our ecosystem's health are already showing steady declines with respect to climate change impacts. The National Climate Assessment lays that out item by item. But to your question about biodiversity, diversity of species is critical to the function of ecosystems and in turn those ecosystem services that we rely on. We might turn to the functioning of coastal ecosystems and recognize the importance of functioning ecosystems to provide fishermen with livelihoods and many other kinds of tourist-related services as well. And so this has a distinct value to Americans. That's been shown again and again and again. And certainly science tells us some of the ways that this committee can help to promote biodiversity and increase ecosystem resilience and therefore support the communities that depend on these services. Some of those ways include, as I mentioned, protecting the lands that these species depend on and using the best science and evidence to inform the support of these ecosystems and the critical species that support their function. So that's just one way. Thank you very much.
Well, I represent a district, California's 49th district, with over 50 miles of coastline. And my friends at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography agree with you, Dr. Cobb, that we absolutely must face the reality, the changing temperature of our oceans, the obvious coastal erosion, unprecedented. And if we don't act, future generations will regret our lack of action. Now is our moment to lead. This should not be a partisan issue. This should be based on science and evidence. And if we can actually focus on facts for a change, maybe we'll get somewhere. And I yield back.
I would like to, if possible, make a comment as one of two women of color that's on this panel, particularly because climate change is going to impact frontline communities more than any other, and the people who are leading are women of color in these communities. Their children are the ones that are going to be impacted. We can't talk about these ecosystems devoid of talking about the impact on human rights and on the people affected. More than 5,000 Puerto Ricans died. That is not nothing. That is not just an ecosystem. That was an entire island that was affected. In the Philippines, in around 2012, 10,000 Filipinos died. We have had Superstorm Sandy that affected life all over New York City and New Jersey, and the infrastructure was destroyed. So I just really don't want to talk about this in silos, as if though we are not talking about whole communities and not treating this issue in a way that is holistic. If we don't lead with how this is going to impact the people least responsible for creating climate change, the people who live within their carbon footprint, the people who are engaged in urban forestry, doubling the amount of open space, stopping the siting of power plants, then we will miss the reason
I'm not cutting
why we
you
have
off.
this
I
panel.
just, the time's up, and we want to stay within the protocol.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it, but I just want to make sure
Thank you.
that folks
Ms.
address
Huff?
those
Ms.
things.
Hull? Oh, Mr. McClintock, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to talk about science and evidence. Professor Curry, are we experiencing the highest temperatures in the planet's history?
No.
When have we seen higher temperatures?
A very long time ago, and there's, at least in some regions, they may be equally as high about 1,000 years ago during the medieval warm period.
So long before the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
Are we experiencing the highest levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide in the planet's history?
No, historically, we're a little bit on the low side, actually, in the current era.
Are we experiencing the worst droughts in recorded history?
Definitely not.
Are we experiencing the most ferocious hurricanes in recorded history?
No. In recent history, in the 1950s, in the Atlantic, the landfalling hurricanes were actually worse than what we've seen in recent decades.
I'm reminded of a poem by Ogden Nash, who wrote, "The ass was born in March, the rains came in November. Such a flood as this," he said, "I scarcely can remember." But our recorded history, as well as our paleoclimatology, informs us that there have been periods where carbon dioxide levels have been much higher than they are today. Temperatures have been much higher and lower than they are today. And long before the significant carbon dioxide emissions of human civilization. Is that correct?
Yes.
A study published in Lancet a few years ago noted that cold weather kills far more people than warm weather. What do you see as the greater threat?
Well, obviously, it depends on the location, but I think the statistics overall across a wide variety of locations do support that cold weather kills more than hot weather.
Well, during the recent cold wave, those states that relied excessively on wind and solar saw electricity outages. Would you say that the greatest single threat in extreme weather, either hot or cold, is a lack of electricity?
Yes, even during hurricanes, what kills a lot of people is the lack of electricity, which has all sorts of trickle-down effects on other things that are needed to save lives during those extreme
How does an over-reliance on wind and solar generation affect our ability to provide abundant, reliable, and affordable electricity?
Well, it doesn't work without natural gas. Natural gas is the perfect partner for wind and solar because of the intermittency, because you can fire up a gas burner and fire it back down. And energy trading, natural gas trading, is what has, I think, stabilized the price of natural gas that actually helps make wind and solar be affordable. So until such time as there is advanced storage technologies, we're going to rely on natural gas as a partner.
Let me get to that if I can. Mr. Hawley, we heard earlier from the governor of Massachusetts about all of their green energy policies, also the governor of South Carolina. My home state of California has adopted even more radical policies. They say they're helping the poor, but I just checked. In Massachusetts, those policies have produced the 11th highest gasoline prices in the country. California now has, as a result of these policies, the second highest gasoline prices in the country. Massachusetts and California are tied for the 6th highest electricity prices in the country. How are poor people helped by paying needlessly sky-high prices for gasoline and electricity?
Sir, you know, I don't have a lot of research to point to. All I have is my anecdotal research when I speak to the thousands of people that I speak to who struggle every single day to pay their electric bill. And the one thing that they talk about is just the need for affordable, reliable energy that we have here in this country. So if we can find a way to reduce the regulations that allow people access to that energy, I think it would go a long way in helping them to reduce the cost of energy for them.
Dr. Curry, a gridlock car creates twice the NOx contaminants and 6 times the carbon contaminants per mile traveled as a car moving at peak efficiency. Doesn't it make more sense to add highway capacity to resolve our chronic traffic congestion if carbon emissions are the goal of reducing?
Transportation policy is much tougher to figure out than power production. And it's a very complex issue. And we need to, and I would like to see us like re-envision what that should be for the 21st century rather than adding patches to our current system.
If we're going to be able to store less moisture in the mountains as snow, does it make sense to build more dams so that we can store surplus water from wet years so that we have it in dry years?
It certainly does. Like water resource management is a big issue. But there are environmental challenges associated with dams and reservoirs also, so it needs a lot of planning to make all this do what you really want it to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you and my colleagues for entrusting me with the responsibilities of Vice Chair of this committee and the chairship for the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands. I look forward to working with you and my colleagues to protect our public lands and to meet our obligations to our Indigenous communities. To that point, this hearing is important and an appropriate place to begin this Congress. As we heard from all our witnesses, climate change poses an unprecedented threat to our communities and our environment. Last year, in my state of New Mexico, the Yeampierre fire burned tens of thousands of drought-stricken acres, while the city of Santa Fe experienced once-in-a-thousand-year flood. Meanwhile, a vast methane cloud hovers over the northwest corner of New Mexico, and this administration has worked to weaken the rules on methane emissions from oil and gas operations. Methane is more than 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide at trapping heat and is responsible for about a quarter of the warming we are experiencing today. Nearby in Arizona, Hurricane Rosa inundated the Tohono O'odham Nation, nearly overtopping their dam, trapping residents behind impassable roads and forcing evacuations. Hurricanes have almost never reached this part of Arizona before. Climate change has forced us to live in a new normal in which fires and floods, droughts and hurricanes wreck our communities and our natural heritage, and it's now time for us to act. I first would like to just thank Ms. Nazar for your commitment and your sacrifice to the things you believe in. I almost want to apologize to you and the youth of this world who go to bed every night worrying about what will happen to our communities because of climate change. And I just want to recognize your presence here. It means a great deal to me and to many of us, so thank you very much. Ms. Yeampierre, I think you are best equipped to answer this question, so I'll ask it to you. Right now, the EPA and Interior Department are run by former lobbyists for coal and oil companies. The New York Times reported last year that a coal magnate was essentially getting his entire wish list of energy deregulations approved by this administration. What role do you believe this corporate capture of the administration will play in being able to address the climate crisis?
I think that the deregulation is exacerbating the climate crisis, particularly in frontline communities and indigenous communities. You're from New Mexico, where you've got nuclear energy and uranium in the lungs and the water and people. It's affecting 60 nations and tribes. The decisions that are being made to support an old school way of thinking about energy are really racing us towards extreme catastrophic events. The truth is that even in places like Kentucky, people are moving away from coal. One of our organizations, which is with the Climate Justice Alliance, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, are working at operationalizing just transitions that move people away from having to depend on an economic system that has destroyed their lives and limited their livability. And so while people in communities are doing that, you've got an EPA that is racing towards moving policies that are basically taking us back in time. So it is really dangerous, and it is a contribution to actually making us look like the day after tomorrow. And it is unfortunate that this old school, dated way of thinking about how we basically consume and use energy is really creating more problems for our communities. I think that honestly, people in different parts of the world are way ahead of us, and that the United States is really looking like this clunky old school machine that can't keep up not only with the technology but the science. And so it's frightening. EPA has always had people in there that are in the pockets of the lobbyists, really slowing down the cogs and making it impossible for us to move as fast as the climate is changing. And so now what we're seeing is really dangerous. So that's what I would contribute.
I appreciate that very much. Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I will submit other questions in writing. Thank you.
Mr. Hearn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for testifying today as expert witnesses on climate change. Each of you has spent your careers involved in climate policy and have helped to generate various solutions to the problem of climate change. Mr. Hawley, your work to reduce energy poverty has been truly remarkable, and your testimony today reflects your well-versed stances on climate change issues. One part of your testimony that interested me a lot was where you wrote, the government requires, quote, the government requires environmental impact studies to estimate the effects of projects like roads and buildings on nature. Shouldn't the government act similarly when it comes to how regulations impact the population? End quotes. Sir. Would it surprise you that we tried to put that into a rule last week and it was voted down by our friends across the aisle? So we would evaluate the impact of our policies on cost-benefit analysis.
Sure. No, I did not know that, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Curry, your testimony reflects your wealth of knowledge on these issues and gives great insight into the climate change debate. In particular, you discussed the increasing concern you have that the climate change problem has been oversimplified. I agree with this statement. as I feel that an overly simple one-size-fits-all, we're smarter than everybody else in Washington, D.C., as we heard our opening statements today from our ranking member, approach to climate change should lead to serious issues, as what may work for one state may not work for another. Would you please elaborate on the problems that an expensive one-size-fits-all, top-down type of solution might cause if implemented?
Well, a whole host of unintended consequences, which some of which we can't even imagine right now. And because of that, we need to avoid the hubris of thinking that we can predict what the future climate will do and that we can actually control the climate. I think if we were somehow successful in putting all these policies into place and getting CO2 emissions down to zero, I think we would be unpleasantly surprised at how little impact this actually has on the things that worry us most about extreme weather events and things like that. Sea level rise is not, we're not going to turn that one on a dime, things like that. It's very tough to change the climate, has a whole lot of inertia in the system, many time scales. Pacific responds very slowly. So, even with success in reducing CO2 emissions down to zero, it would be a long time to turn the corner on having that actually impact the climate. So we need to do some of the more bottom-up type things. And the states are wonderful laboratories for trying out all these adaptation, resilience kind of policies. And I think we should, try to figure out how to help that flourish, the so-called innovation dividend.
Since you brought that up, last week I had the fortunate opportunity. We have an organization called Grand River Dam Authority that is a public-private partnership in our state of Oklahoma that has been around since the 30s, that was formed originally by the government through some grants to build some dams to lock up energy so that we could use that to handle flooding on the Arkansas River, the McClellan-Kerr navigation system as it came to be in the 1960s. We also have in our industrial park in Pryor, Oklahoma, the largest Google server farm in their company. It relocated there to take over a Gatorade plant with the qualification that they were only use renewable power. We had a conscious decision, even though it's not in my district, the state, the GRDA had a conscious decision to make on free market enterprise. Do we want that there? Do we want to go through the cost of upgrading the grid, upgrading the technology to conform to the purchase of Google's 100 megawatts of RECs? And felt like the cost-benefit analysis of that made sense. It was a small plant at that time. It has since quadrupled in size, and from all the Google people that I've talked to, they're so proud of the relationship in a free market environment, working with renewable credits to get to where they're at so that on the grid, GRDA has a great mixture of hydro, solar, wind, coal, and natural gas. To the testimony from Mr. Hawley earlier, that you have to have backups on this so that the cost of having a battery-type environment when you don't have solar and you don't have wind, that you can actually have power to fuel and to warm our homes and businesses around our particular districts and our states and our country. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your testimony. I yield back my time.
Mr. McEachin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, start by thanking you for your leadership on the most urgent threat facing our planet, climate change. I want to thank the panelists for being here today. And in particular, I'm very happy to see my good friend, Reverend Yearwood, here today. Reverend, I've enjoyed working with you over the past, thank you. Reverend, I've enjoyed working with you over the past 2 years, and I look forward to our continued partnership. In that vein, Reverend, I want to start with you. Amazingly, it's been articulated today that there is a mistaken idea that moving towards a clean energy economy will hurt low-income communities and communities of color. I need you to speak to what the rising health and economic costs of climate change will be for those communities, specifically if we fail to move in that direction.
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. First, we can definitely fight poverty and pollution at the same time. And let me say clearly that the assessment that Mr. Holly, respectfully, I disagree completely with what he put forth as the idea that people of color are not concerned about the climate, about climate change, about the environment, about their health, in that aspect. I think that one of the things here in that and we know that 200,000 Americans are dying yearly because of air pollution. We know that we have millions of children and millions of adults who have asthma, emphysema, and are getting cancer. We know that 68% of people of color, particularly black people, are living within 30 miles of coal-fired power plants. We know that the deregulations of the mercury rule and the car rule and and many of the rules being rolled back by EPA would hurt people of color. And so one of the things here that I just want to say, and this is, Mr. Holly, please understand what reason why I was making this assessment is this. For me, as a minister, having buried a young girl because of asthma, that mother no longer cares about how much that utility bill would have cost. That child I had to bury because of asthma, she would have much more been concerned about dealing with a particulate matter in the atmosphere. And so the health concerns are one of the key concerns that are within the communities of color. The idea that we are not also concerned about our future and future generation is frankly absurd. The idea that we don't care that the sea levels are rising and that we will be first and worst, will be hurt by climate change is outlandish. The fact for me, being from Louisiana and seeing what happened with Hurricane Katrina and or Harvey in Houston, those are the kind of things that have a huge impact on communities of color. So to sit up here, honestly, at this critical moment and to then purport the idea that people of color are somehow making this decision that they are more concerned about their energy bill than their health, their energy bill than their life, then that is literally ludicrous. If you think anybody, and it was come to earlier about with this was Black History Month and civil rights, the idea that also that poverty is also put upon with communities of color is also outlandish. That we know this is not about this poor people of color, but poor white people are also the fact of the matter that they want clean air and clean water. As I said earlier, climate change is a civil rights issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Reverend. Am I pronouncing this correctly? Is it Yeampierre, Mr. Yeampierre?
Jean-Pierre, yes.
You know, how do we make sure that as we move towards a clean energy economy, that we invest greener technologies in communities, in low-income communities and communities of color so they're not left behind? How do we do that?
Whether it's in Michigan, whether it's in Detroit, or in Brooklyn, New York, or Richmond, California, where there's fracking going on in people's backyards, communities of color and frontline communities, whether they're in Indian country, are working on operationalizing just transitions. They're looking at different economies of scale. Anything from community-owned solar to trying to figure out how they can create food systems that will withstand the changes that are coming. And there has to be an investment in those communities. And we also need to start thinking about governance differently. Climate change is going to disrupt governance. And so the idea is that we need to start creating transformational partnerships with communities that are in the front line and that are engaging in this kind of transformation. The other thing is that the needs are different everywhere in the country. So the needs of a rural community are not the same of an urban community. Folks that are dealing with mountaintop removal in Appalachia are dealing with different kinds of challenges. And so it isn't cookie cutter, but it is a commitment to trying to work with people on the ground and being led by the ground in partnership, because that's what it's going to take. Climate change is not going to, it is not going to top-down solutions are not going to be sustained over time. They just don't work. People on the ground are going to have to lead, and we're going to have to be partners in those kinds of decisions. So, and sharing and creating a space where we share expertise and information with each other. When Reverend is talking about Louisiana, in my mind, all I'm thinking about was those floating black bodies. As people of African ancestry, that is the truth for all of us all over the United States, right? I think about Puerto Rico, I think about Louisiana, and so I think that it's really important that those communities that are leading and are doing the work, that they not be marginalized and that they be supported and invested in.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Lamborn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to concentrate with my questions and comments on the proposals that are out there to deal with climate change. I don't want to talk about climate change, the science behind it, the man-made role. I want to talk about the proposals that are on the table to deal with it. And the main proposal that I've seen so far is the Green New Deal. Now, I hear that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle may have some proposals coming forward to flesh this out, but right now all we have is the Green New Deal. And we already have presidential contenders endorsing it. We have the Green Party that's talked a lot about it. I'm going to use a few of their facts and figures. They say, and if you go to gp.org, that the transition to a Green New Deal will cost $13 trillion. $13 trillion. Right now, here's our dependence on hydrocarbons. 82% of U.S. electricity is generated from coal, natural gas, and nuclear, leaving 18% from renewables and hydropower. When it comes to transportation, we have 30,000 commercial air flights a day. I don't think not a single one of those is powered by renewables. We have 250 million cars and trucks on the road, and people in the U.S. travel 11 billion miles a day. And the vast majority of that is hydrocarbon powered. Some electric vehicles, some alternatives like propane and biofuel. The Department of Defense in particular, I'm also on the Armed Services Committee, they spend a lot of money on energy, $13 billion a year. Much of that, if not most of that, is hydrocarbon-based. Now, according to the Green Party, in their plan for the Green New Deal, we would have to close all overseas bases, and we would lay off 1.4 million people, both military and civilian. To me, that's extreme. That's very extreme. And this is to do something with the goal of no hydrocarbons by the year 2030, 11 years from now. So I'm going to just ask, I'll start with you, Dr. Hawley, is that realistic?
No, sir. And you actually mentioned that 80% of our total energy sources come from fossil fuels. I know that it's been that way since the turn of the century. It was that way when my grandfather was a black coal miner in Southwest Virginia. It was that way when I was working for Norfolk Southern, and even the last EPA director, Gina McCarthy, under the Obama administration, stated that fossil fuels, we're going to need them at least through 2050.
And Dr. Curry?
Well, the problem that I see with a massively ambitious top-down policy like the Green New Deal is, A, what if we can't do it? What if we're wrong? And there's all sorts of things. It's not a problem that's amenable to that kind of a solution. That's why I propose more of a bottom-up kind of approach. So we can, the so-called innovation dividend, try lots of different things, lots of solutions, and, see what works.
I have to really agree with you. I think that the ingenuity and hard work and creativity of the American people is a real solution here and should not be left out. We shouldn't, like you said, top down from government coercion, government control. That sounds too much like a Soviet 5-year plan or something like that, which is simply not going to work. Now, I understand that if someone comes into Congress, you only have to be 25 years old to be a member of Congress. And we have young people that bring a lot of great qualities, but maybe they don't bring a lot of life experience. And so I guess I can understand if someone has not a lot of life experience and they're proposing something that's extremely unrealistic. Well, impossible. But what I don't understand is if adults and grown-ups who are older and more mature are also advocating something that's impossible. And I see that with some of the presidential contenders who are throwing their names out there. They're plugging for something that is literally impossible. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back the balance of my time.
Well, let me put a pitch in for myself.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect,
No,
I just want
we
to
have
say
to follow-
all movements have been led by young people.
We have
All
to follow the
movements for
protocol.
civil rights,
I know that-
divestment in South Africa, all led by young people. Let's not try to put them in a box.
Ma'am, the protocol and decorum for this, with all due respect, please, I mean, we're trying to run this meeting in a way that is orderly, and while you might have an opinion and want to interject it at that moment, unless you're recognized, you can't. I appreciate that. Let me put in a plug for myself, Mr. Lambert, as an old-timer. I happen to agree with what some of our colleagues are saying here today, and some of our witnesses have said today. I don't know if that puts me out of step with my age group, but I would suggest that the vast majority of Americans feel the way I do. But anyway, Ms. Velasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the ranking member. I am very proud to be the representative of a leading voice and activist on climate change, Ms. Elizabeth Yeampierre. Thank you for your service and for your activism. I would like to ask you the first question. As an advocate for climate justice, with its ethical and political implications, what would you say to someone who thinks we should ignore climate change despite low-income communities being disproportionately at risk from its impact?
Congresswoman, it's wonderful to see you. You've been a champion for environmental justice for years, since even before it became a sexy thing. You've been doing it for all of your districts for so many years that I'm honored to be speaking in front of you. I don't engage climate deniers. I think it slows us down and wastes our time. I engage people who are at the margins, who don't know that they're living at the intersection of injustice and climate change. And I try to inspire and provide information to those people so that they know that their lives are at risk and the future of their children is at risk. I want folks in our communities to know that things like power plants that are run by gas produce NOx, SOx, PM 2.5, and all of those particulates that get trapped in the air passages of our children and our elders, because our elders are going to be tremendously vulnerable in the face of climate change. And so that's what I do. I try to reach people's hearts and minds, but first, they need to have hearts and minds.
Thank you. Ms. DiPerna, in which countries do you see businesses making the greatest efforts towards addressing climate change, and why is that the case?
Thank you.
And I'm sorry if this question has been asked.
No,
I was absent from this important hearing because I'm the chair of the Small Business Committee, and we were holding a hearing on the government's shutdown impact on small businesses. So.
Well, first of all, the question wasn't asked, and secondly, as a New Yorker, I'm also delighted to see you, and thank you for your decades and years of service. With regard to companies in our country, it isn't that they're not doing anything. On the contrary, they see the risks, as I said earlier, and are being driven to take proactive measures to protect their business supply chains and so on. But with regard to your question, these companies operate in a global environment more and more. And so, for example, you have the European Union, which has instigated very, very strong regulations, particularly looking at the fiduciary responsibility of companies and are they operating within parameters that recognize the risks they may face. And of course, shareholders are ordinary people very often. They're not just rich people. 401ks are involved. With regard to some interesting things going on, for example, China. I know there's lots of controversy about China, but China has declared an ecological civilization. It's built into their national program. They're making tremendous investments in solar energy. Morocco has taken tremendous steps to establish targets. And with all due respect to all the debate, this is not an either-or situation. Precisely, we need an energy mix. Precisely, we have to use a bit of natural gas to make renewables less expensive. I mean, this is definitely not an either-or, and it's certainly not a choice between top-down or bottom-up. This is a very complex problem, which has been stated. Everybody has a stake in it, and companies are very much benefiting and would benefit from a smoothing of the requirements so that they don't have to have certain different operations one country to the other. That's very expensive.
Thank you. Ms. Yeampierre, a huge barrier for sustainable communities, whether large or small, seems to be waste management. As a member of the Transform Dump Trash campaign, how can we urge largely populated cities to be aggressive when asking steps toward zero waste?
I was invited to speak in Amsterdam by an international organization that is trying to get businesses to become more sustainable and take responsibility for their practices. All over the world, businesses know that they will suffer and they will lose income because of climate change. And then locally, we've been working with small businesses to become climate adaptable because they're literally the heart of the economic driver in our community. So I think it's going towards zero waste is really important. When we started working with the small businesses and we were trying to get them to move away from the styrofoam. We also presented them with alternatives that were affordable and the idea of creating cooperatives so that they could reduce the costs. There's all kinds of things that we can do with businesses so that we can move them away from using products and working in a way that makes them unsustainable. And that's happening locally.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank the chairman. I just heard that we're citing China as being a good actor. A net increase in new coal plants were built in 2017, with China accounting for 34 of the 61 megawatts that were actually generated. Wow, China is the biggest polluter in the world. India right behind them. Mr. Hawley, I got to come back to you. Now, I've heard statements that climate impacts different communities.
Yes, sir.
What communities are hit most by the policies like the Green New Deal?
Minority and low-income communities. Just because we cannot afford the rising costs that will be associated with these policies. And like I said, many people are struggling right now to pay their energy bills.
Well, this is interesting because I keep hearing this thing about energy. Are you familiar with baseload energy versus intermittent energy?
Somewhat.
Okay, so I guess what we have to look at is baseload energy. It happens all the time,
Yes, sir.
24/7. But intermittent is like solar and wind, where if the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine,
We don't
you
get
no
it.
work.
Right.
Okay, so there's a very big difference along those applications. The problem that we got with baseload energy, with new technology, is molten salts, batteries don't work real well. The other side is not interested in rare earths, in the mining capacities of those that actually help us with new technology called battery capacity. So we got a problem, because it's convenient in Phoenix, Arizona, when you need energy at the middle of the day when you don't get it, or at nighttime when temperatures are at 120. It's kind of hard to tell minority groups, just live with it.
Yes, sir, I would agree with that. And that's one of the things that I would disagree with the Reverend here on. I never said that, we don't agree that climate change does not exist. However, my point is, until we find a solution to harness those renewables to sustain ourselves, then we got to use what we got. And we have an abundance of affordable and reliable energy in this country, and we need to use it.
Oh, I agree. In fact, one of the companies in northern Scottsdale in Arizona uses sun during the day and gas at night because it delivers uniform delivery around our grid. So very important to do that. But I want to concentrate on something else. I mean, I'm a dentist, so science is a big deal to me. And if we're talking about carbon sequestration, it seems to me like what we want to have is a very dynamic, engaging forest. Dr. Curry, would you agree?
Oh, I think land use is a very big deal, including...
I want to get more specific. Photosynthesis.
It's
like plants take in clean oxygen, right, and produces carbon dioxide. No, they take in carbon dioxide, produce oxygen. They take in dirty water, produce clean water. So it seems to me if we really want to address this, we want to look at the best carbon trap we got, which is a healthy, vibrant forest. And I've heard over and over again that climate change is the problem with our forest burning up. That's not the case. I'm from Arizona. Ponderosa forests are 40 to 60 trees per acre. That's fact. That's what a healthy forest should look like. But what we have, because of lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, we have 800 to 1,000 trees per acre. So these starving trees rise to the sunlight, and what ends up happening is when we get these fires, they're no longer landscape fires on the grasslands, they're treetop fires. And I want to quote exactly what we saw last year. Wildfires, this is PolitiFact. Wildfires produce more of one key pollutant, particulate matter, than cars both in California and nationwide. Particulate matter is a mixture of microscopic particles and liquid droplets that, when inhaled, can affect the heart and lungs and cause serious health problems. End of quote. I heard this all along this panel right here about asthma and all that stuff. Listen to this. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, wildfires in California in 2018 released enough, roughly equivalent of 86 million tons of heat-trapping carbon dioxide, the same amount of carbon emissions that are produced in a year, providing electricity for an entire state. So if we're going to concentrate on this carbon sequestration, I think we ought to be looking at our forests being adaptive. I mean, I'm part of the Western Caucus. We had a number of different opportunities to look at Good Neighbor. In fact, one of the most liberal bastions in my state, Coconino County, actually passed a bond levy to actually start thinning the forest, so they had a dynamic interface to stop the fire, number one, and number two is get it more dynamic for carbon sequestration. Would you agree with all those synopses, Dr. Curry?
Most of it. The life cycle of a forest is, has a complex interaction with CO2. At some point, it becomes not so much of a sequestration. So managing forests to prevent wildfires and to maximize the CO2 uptake is certainly a sensible policy.
And one quick indulgence. You know, a dynamic forest is young trees, medium growth trees, and old growth trees, because what we know is young and medium growth trees produce more carbon or oxygen than they do carbon. As the older the tree gets, the less they do. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I am very excited that you have given us this opportunity to really have a robust discussion around climate change. This is an issue that is very important to each of us individually, collectively, to the future of our children. My oldest son, who's now a freshman in college, asks me all the time, when is Congress going to act to address the issues of climate change? And so, as we've heard here today, the impacts of climate change become greater every year. In my home state of Nevada, a desert state, it is particularly vulnerable to the changing climate. By 2050, it is projected that the city of Las Vegas will experience 106 days per year with temperatures upwards of 105 degrees. To provide context, Las Vegas currently averages 70 days per year with temperatures more than 100 degrees. It's hot in Vegas, but the fact that we're having those many days per year over 100 degrees is just one example. Even more concerning, by 2050, the typical number of heat wave days in Nevada is projected to increase from 15 days per year to 55 days per year. According to the Ready Public Service campaign of the Department of Homeland Security, extreme heat results in the highest number of annual deaths among all weather-related hazards. Mr. Chairman, sadly, seniors and children are at greatest risk of death during heat waves. Lake Mead, which supplies water to more than 90% of Las Vegas and roughly 25 million people throughout Nevada, California, and Arizona, continue to deplete at an alarming rate due to increasing temperatures caused by climate change. And in 2016, Lake Mead, which is fed by the Colorado River, reached its lowest level on record and now holds just 37% of its original capacity. As occurrence of extreme heat rises, the depletion of the Colorado River and Lake Mead is projected to worsen in the future. Additionally, more than 1.2 million people living in Nevada, or 46% of our state's population, live in areas at elevated risk of wildfire. As extreme temperatures increase, especially in drought years, the risk of wildfires will continue to rise. So the people of Nevada, like people across the United States, they're looking for solutions, and they are looking for this Congress to act. So Ms. DiPerna, I want to ask you whether your organization, which works with businesses to understand the business investor impacts, if you can talk to me about the heat waves and drought and how they are a significant concern, and how water issues, particularly around companies and investors, are dealing with this particular issue, and if there are examples that you know in our home state in Nevada.
Well, as a matter of fact, right today, we're having our supply chain conference in Las Vegas. And as I mentioned in my testimony, Caesars Entertainment is very concerned about the cost of water. They have facilities in very dry areas, Southern Africa and so on. Dr. Pepper, I mentioned, also concerned. Every company is worried about water. And Dr. Cobb mentioned the carbon pricing. I think it would be including Oklahoma Gas and Electric, are using internal carbon prices to gauge the potential cost of these sort of hidden hitchhikers, which are these tons that go up into the atmosphere that we don't see, but which cost us something. So people are using an internal carbon price in anticipation of regulation or to deal with existing regulations in the jurisdictions where they are covered by regulation. On the water matter, because of increasing water scarcity, companies have begun to also set an internal water price, because they need to begin to come to terms with the increasing cost of water, the increasing scarcity, and even more to the point, the increasing lack of usability. You know, water is potable or usable. We're beginning to have less potable and certainly less usable unless we spend a lot of money to clean it. Now, here's where the impact on the poor is potentially catastrophic, because they will have to pass that cost on. There will never be one other drop of water on this earth. It's all here. And so you can't make water. So we're into an ultimate scarcity there. And I think that I can provide you with a lot of information from our water disclosure. Company after company is concerned about water, and the IT industry in particular, because they need to cool those data centers with water. And so their energy costs are climbing. Cooling is becoming a very big cost. So, you know, it is a complex system. You can't tease out one little bit, but you're the government of the entire country. And so we all look to you to put all the pieces together. Thank you.
Definitely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Cobb, I missed some of your comments earlier, but I understand you had raised concerns about energy production and fisheries, and I just wanted to make note that the home state of Louisiana, we produce more offshore energy in the federal waters than any other state. In fact, I think if you take the other states that produce, the other 5 states that produce, and multiply times 4, that's how much offshore energy we produce. We're also the top fisheries producer in terms of commercial fisheries in the continental United States. So there is a habitat that's created by the energy infrastructure. I don't think we've done a great job managing that in regard to, I think we can take advantage of rigs to reefs programs and others, but I did just want to make note that that's really the hotbed ecosystem or habitat for many of the fisheries in Louisiana. But in the first panel, I brought up a letter from May of 2018. That letter was signed by Senator Schumer, Senator Cantwell, Senator Menendez, and Senator Markey. That letter was written to the President of the United States asking that the President work with our OPEC allies to increase global oil production. Let's say that again. Senator Menendez, Senator Markey, Senator Cantwell, and Senator Schumer, May of 2018, asking the President to work with OPEC to increase oil production. because prices, saying that increased production will result in lower energy prices. Yet, it was interesting in that the first panel, some of the governors that were here talked about how their efforts to help to reduce emissions were benefiting everyone. But I looked, for example, the state of Massachusetts that was represented here. Their kilowatt-hour electricity cost was more than twice that, more than 200% that of my home state of Louisiana. Which I just thought was interesting. Mr. Hawley, I'm just curious, could you share any reflections on just that balance of how do we pursue a climate policy agenda legislation while at the same time not adversely affect our citizens, and how do we strike that balance?
Yes, sir. I actually had the chance to visit your state over the summer.
Come back anytime, any of you.
Down to Port Fourchon, where I had the opportunity to see where all the onshore operations take place for all the offshore. And I also was down there when I took the tour of Port Fourchon. They talked about how countries come from around the world to study the Gulf because it's so rich in wildlife in the environment. And so what that says to me is that energy exploration can coexist with wildlife and the environment. And so as long as that we have that to look at and use as a gauge, I think that's a great place to start.
Thank you. And let me be clear, we have some extraordinary coastal challenges, and Ms. Yeampierre, did I do that okay? We can engage. I'm not a climate denier. I've really struggled with how we find the right balance and sort of criteria that we use here to move forward on legislation. I'm curious, Dr. Curry, one of the rule changes that I tried to make in this committee last week was a rule that would cause us to evaluate the job impacts and economic impacts and try and quantify temperature and sea rise impacts and other things on legislation we progress. Do you have any thoughts on how do we properly use criteria or metrics to determine which legislation is actually going to be helpful in balance, and what may be weighted too hard toward job losses or too hard toward other things that it's not really advancing a public win or a public goal? Does that make sense?
Well, sort of. This is why I call climate change a wicked
Once
problem.
in a while makes sense.
Why myself and others refer to it as a wicked problem. It's hard to even define the problem. The boundaries just seem to ever expand. The impacts are very wide. No matter what policy we propose, there's bound to be unintended consequences. So it's a big challenge to sort through all that. And the approach to me that seems to work the best is where communities and states work to secure their common interests, which are very specific to their location, their economy, their population, their vulnerabilities, as we try to sort through this rather than a big top-down mandate. So that's my thinking on the subject. I wish there was a simple silver bullet solution, but there isn't.
Thank you. And to comply with my commitment, I'm going to yield back my 8 seconds.
The bell was about votes being called. Before adjourning the meeting, let me thank the panelists, the second panel. As many of the questions and perspectives my colleagues have brought up when they asked you questions, and rather than repeat the same ones over again, let me just thank Ms. Nazar. Thank you very much. I think your presence here and your testimony talks about us looking beyond our nose as members of Congress. Think about the future, your generation, generations to follow. And this issue of climate change, what I did learn today that maybe we are not in full-blown, full-throated denial as we were. We're into a different phase, which is climate change avoidance. And what can we do to stall, change, tinker with the science, raise issues that are meant to slow any solution-seeking or policies or legislative initiatives to deal with this very urgent problem. Ms. Yeampierre and Reverend, thank you very much. the frontline communities and communities most impacted in a disparate way by unabated climate change and no solution seeking and an afterthought in the policy making. You made sure that those are front and center in the discussion around issues of justice, equity, access, and inclusion. And I want to thank you for that. That is very, very important. Too often we make policies at this level and then have to backtrack because obviously the impact was never dealt with. And as we seek solutions, equity has got to be part of the discussion all the way down. Dr. Cobb, thank you very much. And bringing to bear what I think is essential in the solution seeking is empirical information and science. And we'll go from there. That having been absent in the last 2 years, that is no longer going to be the case. We should be our guidepost needs to be science and facts and empirical information, and if those are the guideposts, we can move forward. And I have every intention to making sure that's central to the discussion. I also want to thank Ms. DiPerna for bringing to light about businesses and with or without regulations that in anticipation of what is coming, they're preparing. And just as the economic engines of this country, of us in this world, are preparing for climate change, we should be preparing for everyone else to make sure that we confront this and deal with it. And so I appreciate your information very much. And on that note, let me thank you. It's our first hearing. I appreciate your indulgence as I failed to manage the clock accurately, but it all worked out. And we'll go forward. Each subcommittee will now take upon itself from this committee to have this similar hearing dealing with that jurisdiction as we go forward. This committee, as Mr. Bishop said, has a lot under the jurisdiction. We feel we're 25%, over 20% of the legislative adaptation and solution. Public lands, waters, oceans, and the jurisdiction that is broad. And we intend to pursue it that way. It's a task that we can't ignore, and your testimony today made it abundantly clear that's something we can't ignore and an urgency we must deal with haste and not stall, avoid, or ignore it. Thank you very much. Meeting is adjourned.
Pleasure. Talk again.
Definitely.
Well, it was nice to meet you.